She was 43 years old, plain-faced, and carrying a suitcase held shut with a leather belt because the latch had broken 2 years ago and she'd never had reason to fix it. The man at the door looked at her the way people look at something they ordered by mistake. "There's been an error," he said. "There hasn't," she said back. 3 children were starving inside that house. A barn was rotting. A predator had been quietly circling this land for 2 years and nobody had noticed. She noticed. This is the story of the woman everyone underestimated, and the empire she built from their mistake. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had turned soft, like old skin. Eleanor Hart kept it in the left breast pocket of her coat, not because she needed to read it anymore, she had the words memorized, but because it was the only piece of paper in the world that had suggested, even in the most businesslike terms imaginable, that someone somewhere might want her, seeking a capable woman of good character to assist with household management on working cattle ranch. Montana territory. Room, board, and fair arrangement offered. Serious inquiries only. Contact Walker Ranch, Black Ridge, capable, good character. Serious inquiries. Not young, not beautiful, not 22 and soft-handed, and full of the particular kind of hope that hadn't yet been ground down by decades of hard living. Just capable, just serious. Eleanor had written her letter of inquiry in November, sitting at the small table in the boarding house room she'd occupied for 11 months since leaving Cheyenne. She'd been honest in the letter because she'd learned, the hard way and more than once, that dishonesty in such matters only delayed the inevitable humiliation. She wrote that she was 43. She wrote that she had no living family. She wrote that she had spent the better part of her adult life keeping houses, raising children that weren't hers, managing budgets on amounts that would make a sensible man weep, and that she had never once in her life been described as delicate. She sent the letter on a Tuesday. By the following Tuesday, she'd already half convinced herself it wasn't going to work. The reply came on a Thursday, short, almost curt. "You may come. Arrive by the 14th if possible. Ask anyone in town for directions to Walker Ranch. G. Walker." She had read that letter so many times she'd worn a small crease into it too. Yard. The stagecoach from Billings to Black Ridge took 6 hours on a road that had apparently been designed by someone with a personal grudge against human spines. Eleanor sat with her back straight and her worn suitcase on her lap. The belt cinched tight around it because the latch had given out in the spring and she hadn't gotten around to replacing it, and watched the Montana landscape open up around her like something out of a painting she'd once seen in a hotel lobby in Denver. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're also a little bit frightening. The sky was the kind of gray that means business. The mountains to the west wore snow on their shoulders like men who'd given up trying to shake off winter. The grassland was brown and beaten and stretched out endlessly in every direction, and the wind hit the side of the stagecoach at irregular intervals with a sound like a flat hand on a drum. 2 other passengers shared the coach with her. A traveling salesman with a sample case full of patent medicines who'd introduced himself 3 separate times, apparently forgetting he'd already done it, and a young woman, couldn't have been more than 19, with red-rimmed eyes and a hat box on her knee, who hadn't said a single word the entire journey. Eleanor watched the girl for a while. She recognized those eyes. "First time west?" she finally asked. The girl looked up, surprised, like she'd forgotten there were other people in the world. "That obvious?" "A little." The girl looked back out the window. "I'm going to meet someone. Someone I've never met." She paused. "A man." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Marriage." The agency said he was a good man. The girl said it like she was trying to convince herself. "A farmer in Nebraska. He has land." The agency said, "I know what the agency says," Eleanor said gently, not unkindly. The girl looked at her. Are you going the same way? Through the agency?" "Something like it." "Are you scared?" Eleanor considered that honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "I'm cold," she said finally, "and this road is terrible, and I'm hungry. I'll worry about scared once I've had something to eat." The girl let out a small, surprised sound that was almost a laugh, and for the first time since Billings, she straightened her spine a little. Black Ridge was not what you'd call a welcoming town. It sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges of brown rock, and it had the look of a place that had been built in a hurry and then argued about ever since. The main street was mud and wagon ruts. The buildings on either side were a mix of raw lumber and weather-beaten paint, and every single one of them had a sign that seemed to dare you to come inside. The saloon, the dry goods, the livery, the land office, that one with a newer sign than all the others, the paint still bright enough to seem almost aggressive. Eleanor climbed down from the stagecoach with her suitcase in hand and stood in the mud for a moment while the driver unloaded the luggage from the boot. The salesman had already disappeared into the saloon before his bag hit the ground. The young girl with the hat box stood a few feet away, looking up and down the street with the expression of someone who has just been told the news is bad. "You'll be all right," Eleanor told her, meaning it, even though she didn't know if it was true. The girl nodded, holding her hat box like a life ring. Eleanor asked the stagecoach driver for directions to Walker Ranch. He gave her a look that lasted a beat longer than it needed to, taking in the suitcase with the belt, the plain wool coat, the face that nobody had ever written poetry about, and then pointed east along a rutted track that left town between the livery and the undertaker's office, which she privately noted was either a coincidence or someone's idea of humor. 3 miles out, he said. Can't miss it. Big spread, or used to be. He paused. You going to work out there? Yes? He scratched the back of his neck. Well? Huh. He looked like he wanted to say something else and had decided against it. Watch the ruts past the first creek crossing. That road gets bad in November. She thanked him and started walking. The road to Walker Ranch was, in fact, bad past the first creek crossing. Not impassably bad, but the kind of bad that made you pay attention to every step and reminded you with each one that the ground didn't owe you anything. Eleanor walked with her head slightly down against the wind and her suitcase switching hands every 10 minutes when one arm started to ache. She'd been walking long distances since she was a child on her father's failing farm in Kansas, and she had the particular gait of someone who has made peace with the fact that the destination is far away and there's nothing to do about it but keep moving. She thought about the letter. G. Walker. She didn't know what the G stood for. She'd imagined, in those idle moments at the boarding house, a man perhaps 10 years older than herself, weathered and taciturn, not prone to warmth but fundamentally decent. She'd imagined, carefully, with the discipline of someone who had been disappointed before. Nothing beyond that. She was not imagining a man who would be pleased to see her. She had no illusions about that. She reached the gate of Walker Ranch just as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the temperature dropped with it. The gate was iron and wood, with the name branded into a crossbeam overhead, and one side of it hung slightly crooked, the bottom hinge gone loose. She noted that automatically, the way she noted all things that needed fixing, not as a judgment, just as information. The house sat back from the gate along a lane lined with fence posts that had been set at slightly irregular intervals, like a row of old men standing at attention after a long afternoon. The house itself was 2 stories, wood-framed and solid in its bones, but the paint was years past needing another coat, and one of the porch steps had been replaced recently with raw lumber that hadn't been painted to match the rest. The barn to the left was the largest structure on the property, and even in the fading light she could see where a section of roofline had been temporarily patched with boards that weren't quite the right width. Everywhere she looked, work to be done. Everywhere she looked, a property that had been kept alive by sheer effort but hadn't gotten ahead of itself in a long time. She noted all of it. She picked up her suitcase and walked up the lane. Botep. The man who answered the door had clearly not been expecting her yet, or possibly had not been expecting her at all. Grant Walker was 48 years old, she would learn later. Right now, in the doorway with the lamplight behind him, he looked like a man who had been in a long argument with life and wasn't sure who was winning. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical work for decades, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been good-looking once and was still decent underneath the exhaustion. He wore a flannel shirt that had been washed enough times to fade from whatever color it used to be to a particular shade of near-nothing, and he had the look of a man who had completely forgotten that he was supposed to be doing something tonight. He looked at Eleanor. His eyes moved across her the way men's eyes had always moved across Eleanor. Not with cruelty exactly, just with the rapid, unconscious math of assessment, addition, subtraction, conclusion. She watched him arrive at the conclusion. "There's been some kind of error," he said. His voice was low, dry. Not unkind, but not warm. "The agency. I wrote to the agency asking for—" "I know what you asked for," Eleanor said. "I have your original letter of correspondence, if you'd like to review it. My response is also in their files." "I was expecting someone younger." The words came out flat, like a fact reported from a distance. "I expect most people were once." She kept her voice even. "My name is Eleanor Hart. I've traveled 6 hours from Billings and 3 miles on foot from town. If you're going to send me away, I'd ask that we at least do it inside where I can put this suitcase down." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, more like the recognition that she had, at minimum, said something logical. He stepped back from the door. She walked in. The smell hit her first. Not a smell of filth, exactly, but the particular smell of a house where someone had been trying very hard to manage more than they could manage, for longer than was sustainable, dishes that had been washed but not quite rinsed, a pan on the stove with the remnants of something that had been heated rather than cooked, boots near the door that were muddy in a way that suggested the mat had given up weeks ago, and underneath all of it, something else, something harder to name, the smell of a space that had gone too quiet for too long. She set her suitcase down by the door. The front room was large and low-ceilinged, with a fireplace that was cold in November in Montana, which told her something, and a table with 4 chairs, one of which had a stack of unopened mail that had apparently been there long enough to become part of the furniture. A pair of small boots sat in the middle of the floor for no apparent reason. "The children," she said. It wasn't a question. Grant, who had followed her in and was standing a few feet behind her with his arms crossed, made a short sound that might have been an affirmative. 3 of them, upstairs. They've been up there since supper. Was supper— She glanced toward the stove, at the pan she'd smelled. "Beans." He said it the way you say a word when you've already accepted that the situation is what it is. "And before that?" A pause. "Beans." Eleanor turned to look at him directly, which he seemed slightly startled by. "How long has the housekeeper been gone?" she asked. "Mrs. Paulson left in September. I thought I could manage." "How long ago did you realize you couldn't?" He stared at her. Nobody, apparently, had asked him that before, or at least not in those exact terms. "October," he said finally, with the expression of a man confessing something. She nodded once. "Where's your kitchen?" The kitchen was through the back of the front room, and it was cold. The stove had been out for hours, and it had the look of a space that had been efficiently destroyed by people trying their best with limited resources and no real knowledge of what they were doing. There were dishes stacked in an arrangement that suggested intention but not follow-through. A flour sack had been opened and closed so many times that the top of it was dusted with a thin ghost of white across the entire shelf. In the larder, she found potatoes, a ham hock that was not yet beyond saving, dried beans in 3 different jars, cornmeal, a wedge of hard cheese, and 2 eggs. She took stock of it the way she took stock of everything, methodically, without editorial. "I need the stove lit," she said. "Miss Hart." "Mrs. Hart." She said it out of habit, though the marriage had been brief and long over, and she barely thought about it anymore. "And I understand the situation. You expected someone else. I understand that. But there are children upstairs and the fire is out and it's 30 degrees and getting colder. We can talk about my situation once I've dealt with theirs." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Do you have wood?" Grant Walker looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would come to know well. A specific combination of being taken aback, mildly irritated, and grudgingly impressed. He hadn't felt all 3 things at once in a long time. "There's a stack on the back porch," he said. "Bring some in, please. Enough to last the night." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He went and got the wood. By the time the stove was hot, she had the ham hock in a pot with water and the last of the dried sage she'd found on a shelf, and had started a skillet of cornbread from a recipe she carried in her memory, the way some people carry prayers. She worked without thinking about it much because kitchen work, for Eleanor, was the kind of thinking that happened in your hands. Grant sat at the kitchen table. He hadn't meant to. He'd come back in with the wood, stacked it, and then somehow ended up sitting, watching. He couldn't have said exactly why. You don't have to cook, he said. You're not. I haven't decided anything. I know. She didn't look up from the skillet. But the children are going to eat either way, and I already know where everything is, so. She let that finish itself. He was quiet for a moment, then, it would be strange, wouldn't it, paying someone to cook supper and then sending them away before the dishes are done? Extremely strange. Something crossed his face. The ghost of an expression that might have been amusement in a different version of his life. It didn't quite form, but it passed through. What does the G stand for? She asked. He blinked. What? Your letter, G. Walker. What's the G stand for? He looked like he'd forgotten anyone might ever ask him that. Grant. That's a fine name. She turned the cornbread. Mine's Eleanor, since you haven't asked. I know. You said. I said Mrs. Hart. That's not the same thing. The ghost of the expression passed through again. Closer this time. The children came down 15 minutes later, drawn by the smell. This was a thing Eleanor had observed about children in houses where warm meals had become unreliable. They developed a kind of sixth sense for the smell of actual cooking, as opposed to the smell of survival food, and they followed it with the focused attention of animals following water. There were 3 of them. The youngest was a girl named Clara, 4 years old, possibly 5. She had the slightly unmoored quality of a child who had grown a little older than anyone had properly noticed. She came down the stairs holding a cloth rabbit by one ear and regarded Eleanor from the bottom step with enormous, solemn eyes. She had a cough. Eleanor heard it before she saw her, the dry, persistent kind that said it had been there for a while. The middle child was a boy, Thomas, 7, who came into the kitchen in his socks and immediately stood on his tiptoes to see what was in the pot. Is that ham? He said. It is, Eleanor said. He looked at her with undisguised evaluation. Who are you? My name is Eleanor. I'm going to be... She glanced briefly at Grant, who was still sitting at the table with his arms crossed and no expression she could read. I'm going to make sure you eat a hot meal tonight. Thomas seemed to decide this was sufficient. He sat down at the table across from his father. The oldest was the one who didn't come down. There's one more, she said quietly to Grant, after she'd gotten Thomas settled and Clara up on a chair with her rabbit. Daniel. Grant's voice shifted slightly. Something complicated moved through it. He's 14. He'll eat when he feels like it. Has he eaten today? The pause was long enough to be an answer. Eleanor put a portion of the soup in a bowl, cut a square of cornbread, set them on a plate, and looked at Grant. Which room? Miss Hart. Mrs. Hart? She picked up the plate. Which room? The room at the end of the upstairs hall had a door that was firmly closed, and underneath it, in the gap between the door and the floor, she could see the amber flicker of a lamp that hadn't been turned off yet. She knocked. Once. Clearly. Silence. She knocked again. I'm not hungry. The voice was 14, all rough edges and a middle register that hadn't fully settled. Angry the way 14-year-olds are angry. Completely and without sufficient explanation. All right, Eleanor said through the door. Then I'll leave this out here for later, in case you change your mind. Silence. She set the plate on the floor outside the door. She straightened up. She stood there for a moment, looking at the closed door. The little one has a cough, she said to the door. Has she had it long? Nothing. Then, since last week? Does she run a fever in the evenings? A pause. Longer than the last one. Sometimes. All right, thank you. She went back downstairs. Behind her, as she reached the bottom step, she heard very faintly the scrape of a chair across wooden floorboards, then quiet footsteps, then the soft sound of a door easing open. After the children had eaten and Clara had been carried back upstairs, she'd fallen asleep at the table with her rabbit still clutched in one hand, which was the most heart-splitting thing Eleanor had seen in some time. Grant Walker stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Eleanor wash the dishes with the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered so gradually he hadn't noticed until it was done. I want to be clear about something, he said. Go ahead. I'm not in a position, financially, I'm not in a position to pay what I'd need to pay for a full housekeeper and cook and whatever else. He said it like it cost him something, which it did. I put that advertisement in hoping for a partnership arrangement, someone who would have a stake in the ranch's success, not just an employee. Eleanor dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She turned to face him. I understand. And I need you to understand that what I pictured when I wrote that advertisement was someone younger, she said. I know, you said. She set the towel down. Mr. Walker, I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm not asking you to pretend you're glad I'm here. I'm asking you to consider one thing. She looked at him steadily. Did your children eat tonight? He said nothing. Did they eat something other than beans? Still nothing. Then whatever I am or am not, I am useful. She picked up her suitcase from beside the door where she'd left it 5 hours ago. Now, if there's a spare room, I'd like to sleep in it. In the morning, I'll look at what needs doing and we can talk about the rest. Grant Walker stood in his own kitchen doorway and couldn't find a single thing to say. The cough, she added as she started toward the stairs. For Clara, do you have mustard in the house? Yes, I think. Good. I'll make a compress in the morning. It'll help. She went up the stairs. He stood where he was for a long time after her footsteps faded. The spare room was small and cold and had a window that rattled when the wind shifted. The bed had a mattress that had been turned recently. She could tell by the faint impressions of previous use being in the wrong orientation. And there were 2 blankets, which was one less than what the temperature required, but one more than nothing. Eleanor set her suitcase on the floor, unbelted it, and sat on the edge of the bed. She allowed herself, in the privacy of that cold room, about 3 minutes of feeling the full weight of the situation. The way the man had looked at her, the way he would probably continue to look at her, the long work ahead, the uncertain outcome, the very real possibility that she was investing herself in something that wouldn't hold. 3 minutes. Then she opened her suitcase, found her nightgown, changed, and got under both blankets. The wind hit the window. The house settled around her like a ship finding its keel. She slept. 3 days passed before she found the ledger. She hadn't been snooping. That wasn't her way. She'd been reorganizing the kitchen larder, properly organizing it, not just rearranging it. And she'd moved a loose board in the back of the lower shelf, and the ledger had been there behind it. Not hidden, exactly. More like put somewhere out of the way, with the vague hope that being out of the way was the same as being dealt with. She took it to the kitchen table, sat down with it, and spent an hour reading it in the morning light. When Grant came in from the barn for the noon meal, she was still sitting there. You found that, he said. Yes. He came to the table, poured himself coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove, and sat down across from her. He looked at the ledger, the way people look at things they've been dreading looking at for a long time. How bad? The ranch itself is in better shape than these numbers suggest, she said. Or it should be. She turned the book toward him and pointed to a column of entries from September. These supply expenditures. Who did you purchase from? Maddox Brothers. They supply half the ranches between here and Billings. Did you receive everything you ordered? He opened his mouth, and then he closed it slowly. And she watched something come into focus behind his eyes. Last September, he said, slowly, the winter feed order. We were short. I thought it was a shipping error. How short? Maybe a quarter of what we ordered, but I paid for the full amount. The invoice said full delivery. He looked at her. I assumed... The driver said the load count was right. I didn't go back and measure the actual... And the fence on the east pasture, she said. When did the wire on the north section go? October. I thought it was just age. We got a winter storm through, and I thought... When I walked the fence line yesterday morning, Eleanor said, keeping her voice even, the posts along that section were sound. New, some of them. The wire itself had been cut, not broken. Cut cleanly, and then bent to look like a break. Grant went very still. And the hand you let go in October, she continued, Pete Harlow. You said he'd quit. He did quit, gave me 2 weeks' notice, and left for... He said he had family in Oregon. He's working at the Donahue Ranch now, Eleanor said. I heard it in town when I went for flour yesterday. The Donahue Ranch, which, as I understand it, borders yours on the northeast corner. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when several things that seemed unrelated suddenly arrange themselves into a shape. Sterling Crow owns the Donahue Ranch, Grant said. His voice had changed, flatter, like something had drained out of it. Yes. Eleanor closed the ledger. He also, according to the conversation I heard at the dry goods store yesterday. And I want to be clear that I was not eavesdropping. People in small towns simply speak at a volume that assumes agreement. He also recently acquired the Morrison land, the Beckett homestead, and apparently has made inquiries about the Fletcher property on the South Road. All failed properties. All properties that failed within the last 2 years. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Walker, I've kept accounts for a number of different households over the years. I've seen financial mismanagement. I've seen bad luck. I've seen the natural consequences of grief and inattention. She paused. This is not that. He was looking at the ledger. Someone's been bleeding us. Systematically, and from more than one direction. She folded her hands on the table. The question is who knows, and what you want to do about it. Grant looked up at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been trying to figure out what's wrong with a machine for a long time, and has just watched someone put their hand on the right lever. How did you see all this? He asked. I'm good with numbers, she said, and I was here. She got up and went back to the stove to check on the noon meal. In the weeks that followed, the Walker Ranch changed in ways that were both visible and not. Visibly, the kitchen was clean and stayed clean, and there was always something on the stove or in the oven, and the cold fireplace in the front room became a fireplace that burned every evening after supper. The crooked gate hinge got fixed on a Saturday afternoon when Eleanor appeared in the yard with a wrench, and Grant, who'd been intending to fix it for 6 weeks, found himself handing her tools before he quite decided to. 2 of the fence posts on the south pasture were replaced, the broken step on the porch was sanded and painted to match, and the stack of unopened mail on the front room table was sorted, responded to, and filed. The things that changed but couldn't be seen. Thomas started asking at dinner what they were having tomorrow. Clara's cough cleared up within 10 days of the mustard compresses and the elder tea that Eleanor made from the dried herbs she found in the very back of the larder and identified from long experience. And Daniel, who had been existing mostly as a presence felt through closed doors and footsteps overhead, started appearing at the table for breakfast. He didn't talk much. Eleanor didn't push it. She served him food and said good morning and treated him like what he was. Someone carrying more than a 14-year-old should be carrying and not sure what to do with the weight. She recognized that. She'd been carrying heavy things for a long time herself. She didn't look like you, he said one morning, very suddenly, without preamble. Eleanor had been slicing bread, and she kept slicing it because she'd learned that sometimes the way to keep someone talking is to do nothing remarkable with your hands. Who didn't? My mother. He was looking at the table. People probably told you that you were replacing her or something, the women who came before. There were others. 2. They didn't last 2 weeks. He said it without pleasure. They both cried. One of them said she didn't realize it would be so. She used the word remote, about the land. She'd been from Philadelphia. I'm from Kansas, Eleanor said. Nothing seemed remote to me after Kansas. Something shifted in his face. What did happen in Kansas? A great deal, she said, setting the sliced bread on the board. None of it good enough to talk about before I've had more coffee. She poured him a cup, which he hadn't asked for, and he wrapped both hands around it the way people do when they're cold in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. She was better at this, he said. My mother. She made it look easy. Nothing about this is easy, Eleanor said. Anyone who makes it look easy has just done it long enough to hide the effort. He was quiet for a while. The fence you fixed on the south pasture, he said finally. Pa's been saying he'd get to it for 2 months. I know. She sat down across from him with her own cup. It needed doing. He gets... Daniel stopped. He goes away sometimes. In his head. He's here, but he's not. He said it with the precise, specific grief of a child who loves a parent and has watched that parent become unreachable and has no idea what to do with the love. I've seen it, Eleanor said gently. Does it get better? She considered telling him yes. It always gets better, because it would have been the kind thing to say. She thought about the year after her own marriage ended, The 2 years after that, the decade in between. The way grief moves through a person like weather, unpredictable, with no regard for schedules or convenience. It becomes different, she said. It becomes something you carry differently. Not lighter, necessarily, just differently shaped. Daniel looked at her. That's not the same as better. No, she agreed. It's not. She wrapped her hands around her cup. But different is somewhere to start. December came down hard on Black Ridge that year. 2 weeks before Christmas, they lost 6 head of cattle that had been in the east pasture overnight when a section of fence went down. Not cut this time, or not that she could prove, but the timing of the break, in a section that had been recently checked, and the particular pattern of the cattle's movement when Grant and Daniel found them 2 miles north of the property line, all of it had the feeling of something deliberate about it. Could be coincidence, Grant said that evening. They were sitting at the kitchen table after the children had gone to bed, the remains of supper cleared and the lamp between them. He'd taken to doing this, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, talking through the day's problems. Eleanor wasn't sure exactly when it had started. It had happened the way most things happen between people who are in close proximity under difficult circumstances. Gradually, without a formal beginning, and then all at once. It could be, she said, but you don't think so. I think coincidences happen. I also think that when coincidences follow a pattern, they stop being coincidences. She tapped the ledger, which had become a kind of ongoing document between them. 3 incidents in 60 days, always when you're most stretched, always when the damage is maximum. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit of his, turning things. She'd noticed it. Crow wants the land, he said. Crow wants all the land, she said. Yours specifically because it sits between the Morrison property and the Donahue spread. If he owns both of those and yours in between, he controls the water access to the entire northern valley. She had spent 2 evenings studying the county survey maps she'd found in Grant's desk drawer. With that water access, he could effectively price every other rancher in the valley out of viability within 5 years. Grant stared at the table. How do you know that? I grew up watching my father's land get taken, she said. It came out flat, factual. She wasn't looking for sympathy, and she didn't modulate it to invite any. Different man, same method. I was 12. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it was finished. She looked at him. I swore I'd know it if I ever saw it again. The lamp between them flickered as a gust of wind found some gap in the house's defenses. It steadied again. What do you think we should do? Grant asked. She'd been waiting for that question for 3 weeks. Document everything, she said. Every loss, every incident, every piece of evidence of interference. Dates, locations, specifics. We need a record that holds up when a lawyer looks at it. She opened the ledger to a fresh page. We also need to talk to the other ranchers. The ones who lost their land. They may not have understood what happened to them, but they'll remember the incidents. Crow has influence in this town. Half the men on the county board, not all of them, she said. And county boards care about things staying legal. Whatever Crow has done, he's been careful. If he were operating completely openly, he wouldn't need to be subtle about it. She met his eyes. Subtle means he has something to hide. Something to hide means evidence exists. Grant looked at her for a long time. Eleanor, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noted it. She didn't make anything of it, at least not out loud. Yes? Why are you doing this? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine, the kind you ask when you've been trying to figure something out and finally can't figure it out alone. You don't own this land. You have no stake in the outcome. You could leave tomorrow and— The children are here, she said. A pause. And she considered whether to say the rest. She decided she would, because she'd gotten old enough that not saying things seemed less and less worth the effort. And this is happening, she said. I'm here, and I can see it, and I understand it. And walking away from something you can see and understand when there are children and a good man losing everything to a predator. She stopped, looked at the lamp. I've walked away from things I shouldn't have. I don't do it anymore. Grant didn't say anything for a while. The wind found the house again. The lamp held. We'll start the documentation tomorrow, he said. I already started it, she said. 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. She looked back. This time the expression that crossed his face wasn't a ghost of something. It was actual, real and visible and human, the look of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the first evidence of another person's strength underneath some of the weight comes as an almost physical sensation. He covered it quickly, but she'd seen it. "Good," he said. "Then we have a place to start." Acha. By the time the new year turned, Eleanor Hart had been at Walker Ranch for 7 weeks. The town of Black Ridge had opinions about this, which was not a surprise. Small towns running on limited entertainment have opinions about everything, and the opinions were various. Most of them boiled down to some version of pity, or judgment, or the particular combination of both that happens when people look at a woman who has done something unconventional and can't quite decide whether to admire her or condemn her, so they do both simultaneously and call it concern. The women at the general store talked about her whenever she came in for supplies. She could tell by the way conversation shifted when she entered, the way a room shifts when a door opens and lets in cold air. Some of the talk was cruel. Most of it was simply the small cruelties that gather around any woman who does not fit the expected shape of her life. She bought her flour, and her salt, and her needles, and she said good morning to everyone who made eye contact and thanked the proprietor by name, and walked back out into the cold and got on with it. There was one afternoon, though, a Tuesday in January, when she was at the counter waiting for her order, and a woman she didn't know, perhaps her own age, perhaps older, the wife of one of the county board members, she thought, stopped beside her and said, in a voice not quite low enough to be private, "It must be difficult, being so determined, when no one's really asked you to be." Eleanor looked at her. She took the full measure of the statement and the woman who'd made it, and she thought about several possible responses, and she chose the simplest one. "Someone has to be," she said. She picked up her order and went out to the wagon. February. The cold so deep and complete that it had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like the natural state of the world. Ice on the water trough every morning that needed breaking. The cattle burning through feed at a rate the winter stores were barely keeping up with. The kind of cold that tests whether a family has actually become a family, or whether it's just people in proximity who haven't had occasion to fail each other yet. They were a family by then, not by any formal declaration, not even by any single moment. Just by the accumulated weight of 7-year-old Thomas reading to Clara from the illustrated book Eleanor had found at the back of the church rummage sale, and by Clara developing the habit of taking Eleanor's hand when they walked in the yard, and by Daniel appearing one morning with a list of fence repairs he'd prioritized by urgency with his own hand in handwriting that was still finding its adult shape. "Good list," Eleanor said, studying it. "I added the gate hinge on the north pasture." He was looking at the wall, not at her. "It's been loose since October. Pa missed it." "He's had a lot to carry." "Yeah." He took the list back. "So have you." He said it with the difficulty of a teenage boy saying something genuine and knowing he's saying it, which is one of the harder things humans are asked to do. Yeah." He went out before either of them could make more of it than it was. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the feeling of that, which was something she allowed herself. Then she went back to work. Grant found her in the barn on a Thursday afternoon in late February, in the middle of what should have been a simple task, checking the feed stores against the winter inventory, when she realized with a cold, specific certainty that they were short by approximately a third of what they should have had. She was standing with the ledger open in one hand and a lamp in the other, counting bags she should not have needed to count, because she'd counted them in December and the numbers should not have changed the way they had changed. Problem? Grant appeared in the barn doorway. She turned to face him. "We're missing feed." He went still. "How much?" "Roughly 120 bushels of the winter oat supply." She held up the ledger. "I counted in December. I documented it. This is not a counting error." "You're saying someone—" "I'm saying the feed is not here, and I know it was here." She looked around the barn, at the careful stacking of the remaining bags, at the way the space where the missing stores should have been was just slightly too neat, as if someone had rearranged things to make the gap less obvious. "Someone came in here and took it." Grant walked past her into the barn, counted for himself, came back with the same look on his face that she had, cold and clear and not panicked, which she was grateful for. "In winter," he said, "without enough feed, the cattle start. We lose stock," she said. "And if we lose enough stock, we miss the spring payment on the loan." She'd found the loan documents in the same desk drawer as the survey maps. She hadn't said anything about it until now. I know about the loan. He looked at her. You went through my desk. Your drawer was open. I was looking for the survey maps. I apologize. She didn't look away. The loan payment is in March. The amount is... I know the amount. If we lose the cattle, I know. His jaw was tight. I know what it means. Then we need to figure out where the feed went and whether we can source more before the worst of the cold. She'd already been calculating this in her head since she started counting. There's a supplier in Helena that Maddox Brothers doesn't work with. I found the name in the supply ledger from 2 years ago, before Maddox Brothers became the primary supplier. If we can get a message there by the end of the week, Helena is 80 miles. I know. She looked at him steadily. Grant, we're not losing this ranch. The use of his given name, she knew, was deliberate. She'd been deliberate about it. She watched him hear it. The children, he said. It wasn't a sentence, it was a weight. I know. She put the ledger under her arm and picked up the lamp. Come inside, it's too cold to think out here. We'll plan tonight and decide in the morning. She walked past him and out of the barn. He stood in the cold for a moment. Then he followed her. Somewhere in the house, Clara was singing to herself, one of the small, wordless songs that 4-year-olds invent and sing entirely for their own benefit, not for an audience, just because the sound is comfortable. Thomas had fallen asleep over his arithmetic, and Daniel had covered him with a blanket and left him at the table, a kindness so unconscious that Daniel probably hadn't noticed he'd done it. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window for a moment after supper, looking out at the dark where the barn sat, and beyond it the fence lines, and beyond them the vast Montana dark that contained whatever it was going to do to them next. She thought about the woman at the county store. It must be difficult, being so determined, when no one's really asked you to be. She thought about her father's land, the day the bankmen came, the way her father had stood in the yard with the look of a man who hadn't understood until too late that the world was capable of that particular kind of deliberate harm. She thought about the advertisement, folded soft in her coat pocket. Capable woman of good character. She was both of those things. She had always been both of those things. Nobody had ever bothered to mention that capable and good character sometimes mean you end up standing in other people's wars because you're the only one in the room who can see the whole field. She turned away from the window, picked up the ledger, sat down at the table, started writing. The lamp burned. The house held. In the east pasture, the cattle were cold but alive. For now, that was enough. The message to the Helena supplier went out on a Friday, carried by the stagecoach driver for $1, and the promise of Eleanor's best cornbread the next time he came through, a currency he seemed to regard as entirely reasonable. They had a reply by the following Wednesday. Yes, the supplier could fill the order, but delivery would take 3 weeks. And the price was 15% above what Maddox Brothers charged. Grant had stared at that number for a long time. We pay it, Eleanor said. It's money we don't have. It's money we have less of than we'd like. There's a difference. She was already writing the confirmation letter. If we don't have the feed, we lose stock. If we lose stock, we lose the ranch. 15% above market rate is the cheapest problem on this list. He hadn't argued. She was learning that about him. That he argued when he thought she was wrong and didn't when she was right, which was more than she could say for most men she'd worked for. The feed arrived in 3 shipments across 2 weeks in March, pulled by a team of draft horses that appeared out of the gray morning like something from a more reliable world. Eleanor stood in the yard and counted every bag as it came off the wagon. She checked it against the invoice twice. She made the driver sign his name to a delivery confirmation she'd written herself, which seemed to surprise him. Didn't know Walker Ranch had got so official, he said. It has now, she said, and handed him the signed copy. The stock survived the winter, but surviving was not the same as being safe, and Eleanor knew the difference. The documentation she'd been keeping through January and February had grown into something substantial by the time March mud came. 41 pages of the ledger's back section, written in her precise, tight hand, dates, amounts, incident descriptions, witness names where available, missing feed, cut fence wire, a hay fire in October that Grant had attributed to a spark from the forge, but that she noted had started from the windward side of the barn, not the side facing the forge. The timing of Pete Harlow's departure and his subsequent employment. The pattern of Maddox Brothers' short deliveries, cross-referenced with the dates of Crow's land acquisitions. She'd laid it all out on the kitchen table one evening for Grant. He'd read through it without saying anything for 20 minutes, turning pages slowly, and when he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize as his version of something moving through him that he didn't entirely know what to do with. "How long did this take you?" he asked. "A while. Evenings, mostly." "Eleanor?" He stopped. This is enough for a lawyer. Maybe more than enough." "Maybe," she said carefully. "The challenge is finding a lawyer who isn't already in Crow's pocket." She'd been thinking about this. "There's a man in Billings, a civil attorney named Whitmore. His name came up in the land record filings I found at the county office. He's handled 3 property disputes in this valley in the last 5 years, and he's won 2 of them." "You went to the county office?" "Last Thursday, while you were at the feed store." He stared at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I wanted to know what I'd found before I told you I'd gone looking." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you now." He was quiet a moment. "And Whitmore, can we afford him?" "Probably not." She folded her hands on the table. "But there's a provision in Montana territorial law. I found the statute in the county clerk's legal reference files. He was very helpful once I explained what I was looking for. A provision that allows for contingency representation in cases of demonstrated property fraud. If Whitmore takes the case on contingency, he collects his fee from any damages awarded." Grant looked at her for a long time. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you spent a Thursday at the county office reading territorial statutes. The clerk made excellent coffee and I had questions. It seemed efficient." Something crossed Grant's face. The expression that had been becoming more frequent over the past weeks, less guarded than the first version of it she'd seen. Still complicated. Still a man carrying grief like a structural feature of himself. Something load-bearing that he didn't know how to set down without the whole architecture shifting. But underneath that, something else was beginning to surface. Something that had been there a long time and hadn't had occasion to show itself. He didn't name it. Neither did she. "We should write to Whitmore," he said. "I already drafted the letter," she said. "It's on the desk. I wanted you to read it before it went." He almost laughed. It didn't quite get there. But it was close, and it was real, and Eleanor decided that was enough for a Tuesday evening in March. The letter went out the next morning. Whitmore's reply came in 9 days. He was interested. He was coming to Black Ridge to look at the documentation. He was not making promises, but he was coming. Eleanor read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went to tell Grant. He was in the barn with Daniel, the 2 of them working on a section of damaged stall boarding. And when she came in and told him Whitmore was coming, Grant set down his hammer and sat on a hay bale and put his face in his hands for a moment. Not in despair, but in the way of a man who has been holding something tight for a very long time and has just felt the grip loosen slightly. Daniel watched his father, then looked at Eleanor, and she gave him the small nod that she'd found worked for 14-year-olds in moments where words were too much. He gave her the same nod back. Then he picked up the hammer and went back to the boards. She left them to it and walked back to the house in the cold March air, thinking about all the things that still needed to happen before any of this was over. A great many things still needed to happen. And Sterling Crow, as far as she could tell, had not yet begun to feel threatened. That was about to change. Crow came to the ranch on a Thursday in late March. He arrived in a black-painted wagon with 2 men on the seat beside him, and the kind of unhurried confidence that belongs to men who have never had to hurry because they've never doubted the outcome of anything. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window when she heard the wagon on the lane. She recognized him from the description she'd pieced together from conversations around town. Large man, past 50, dressed better than the territory strictly required, with the bearing of someone who had decided very early in his life that other people existed primarily to facilitate his plans. She set down the dish she was drying and went to the front door and opened it before he could knock. Crow stopped on the porch step, mildly surprised. The 2 men with him, both younger, both with the specific blankness of men hired to stand near someone and look capable of things, stopped behind him. "Morning," Crow said. He had a voice like gravel poured over wood, smooth on the surface, hard underneath. "Is Walker home?" "He's working," Eleanor said. "Can I help you?" Crow looked at her with the same rapid assessment that Grant had used in November, though this version had something different in it. Not the helpless mathematics of a man surprised by his own situation. Something more calibrated, more deliberate. "You must be the housekeeper," he said. "I heard Walker had taken on some domestic help." "I'm Mrs. Hart." She held the door without opening it wider or closing it. "And you're Mr. Crow." He seemed faintly pleased that she knew his name. Men like him often were. It confirmed their belief that they occupied the center of things. "I have a business proposition for Mr. Walker. I prefer to discuss it with him directly." "I'll let him know you called." She didn't move from the doorway. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. More like the micro-adjustment of a man who has encountered a small obstacle he hadn't anticipated and is deciding whether to go around it or through it. "It would be in Walker's interest to hear what I have to say," he said. His voice stayed pleasant, which was its own kind of thing. "I'm sure he'll give it the attention it deserves," Eleanor said. "Good morning, Mr. Crow." She closed the door. She stood on the inside of it for 3 breaths, listening, heard the men on the porch not moving. Then the particular sound of a large man making a deliberate choice to walk away rather than push the moment further. Footsteps. The porch step. The wagon. She went to the side window and watched the wagon move back down the lane. Crow didn't look back. She picked up her dish and went back to drying it. When Grant came in for lunch and she told him, he stopped in the middle of taking his coat off. "You turned him away?" "I told him you'd give his proposition the attention it deserves." She put the dried dish on the shelf. "Which I expect you will." "Eleanor, Crow is—" He stopped, tried again. "He's not someone who responds well to being put off." "No," she agreed. "He isn't." She turned to face him. "But he came unannounced, without an appointment, to your home, with 2 large men in his wagon, and he asked to see you about a business proposition. If you'd been home and walked out to meet him on those terms, you'd have been having his conversation, on his schedule, from a position of being caught off guard on your own land." She met his eyes. "Now he knows you have someone between him and you. That's information he didn't have before." Grant stood with his coat half on, looking at her. "You wanted him to know about you," he said slowly. "I wanted him to know that this house has someone paying attention," she said. "Those are different things." He finished taking his coat off, slowly, and hung it on the hook. He sat down at the table. He looked like a man reassembling a picture he'd been looking at wrong. "He'll come back," he said. "I know." She put the soup on the table. "We'll be ready." Crow came back the following week. This time he came alone, just himself, no men in the wagon, which was either a gesture of conciliation or a different kind of move entirely, and Eleanor didn't trust it either way. She was at the dry goods store when the wagon rolled past, and she watched Crow from the window and made note of the direction he was going. He didn't go to Walker Ranch. He went to the county land office. She mentioned this to Grant that evening, and they sat with the implications of it for a while. A man like Crow didn't visit the land office without a reason, and the reasons available to him in that office were limited in their variety, but significant in their potential. "The loan," Grant said. "The March payment went," she said. "That's done. But the April payment—" He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she knew meant he was moving through the math of it and arriving at the same place. "If Crow has someone at the bank, we don't know that he does. But if he does, then we make sure the April payment is there," she said simply. "And the May one. We give him nothing to work with. The spring calves won't be ready to move until June." "I know." She'd already been thinking about this. "There's the North pasture hay we managed to hold back. McGuire at the livery offered $2 a bale last month when we couldn't spare any. Has that changed?" "Might have. The Hendricks Ranch lost a lot of their winter stores." He was doing it now. Thinking forward, not just cataloging the problems, but moving through them. She'd noticed this shift in him over the past weeks. The slow return of a man who'd forgotten he was capable of strategy, remembering. "Offer McGuire 12 bales," she said. "Don't let him know you need to move them. Give him the price he gave you last month and let him think he's getting a deal." She paused. "Daniel could take the wagon in on Saturday. He's old enough, and McGuire likes him." Grant looked at her with that complicated expression again. "Daniel talked to you about McGuire?" "He mentioned it once. He likes working with horses." She shrugged slightly. He's good with them. McGuire probably sees it too. Grant was quiet for a moment. You notice everything, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something else. Something closer to the particular vulnerability of someone realizing they have been seen more fully than they expected. I notice what's in front of me, she said. It's a habit. Where does that come from? She thought about answering that honestly and decided she would, as she usually did. When I was young, paying attention was the difference between things going badly and going worse. My father, when things were falling apart on the farm, nobody talked about it. You either saw it or you didn't, and if you didn't see it, you got caught by surprise. She looked at the lamp. I got caught by surprise once. I decided not to make that mistake again. How old were you? 12. The same age she'd told him before, the age she'd been when the bankmen came. Old enough to understand and young enough that I couldn't do anything about it. She folded her hands. That's the worst age to be for something like that. He was looking at her in a way that was different from the early weeks. Not the rapid assessment of November, not the grudging recalibration of December. Something slower, more deliberate. The way you look at something you've been looking at from a distance and have now moved closer to, and the closeness changes what you see. She looked back steadily because she was past the age of looking away from things. You should have been somewhere better than this, he said. Long before now. She considered that for a moment. Maybe, but then I wouldn't be here. She stood up, gathering the cups. And someone needed to be here. She went to the basin to wash the cups, and he didn't say anything else, and the house held them both in its ordinary nighttime quiet, and Eleanor decided this was one of those moments she'd let herself keep without examining it too closely. It was 2 days later that they found the first of the surveyor stakes. Daniel found them, actually. He'd been checking the eastern fence line on Saturday morning before driving the hay wagon into town, which had become his Saturday routine without anyone formally deciding it would be. He came back to the barn at a run, which was how Eleanor knew it was serious, because Daniel was not the kind of 14-year-old who ran unless he had reason. They're stakes, he said. He was out of breath. Survey stakes, orange paint on them. They go along the eastern property line, but they're on our side, inside our fence, by maybe 12 feet. Grant, who had been in the barn, went very still. How many? Eleanor asked. 8, maybe more. I only went far as the north corner before I came back. Show me, Eleanor said. She followed Daniel at a pace that was close to running herself, with Grant 2 steps behind them. The morning was cold and clear, the frost still on the ground in the shadows, and they crossed the east pasture in silence. The cattle watched them pass with the incurious patience of animals who have decided that humans are probably not worth worrying about. The stakes were exactly as Daniel had described. Wooden pegs with bright orange paint on the top, driven into the ground at regular intervals along a line that was very precisely 12 feet inside Walker Ranch's established fence line. They'd been driven in recently. The ground around them was still slightly disturbed, hadn't had time to settle. Eleanor crouched beside the nearest one and looked at it without touching it. This happened last night, she said. The ground hasn't frozen back. Someone was on my land, Grant said. His voice had the flat quality she'd learned to recognize as controlled anger. Someone employed by Crow, she said. These are survey stakes for a property claim. If he's filing an amended boundary description at the county office, if he has a surveyor's certification that shows this line, she stood up. Is there anything in your original deed that specifies the eastern boundary measurement from a named landmark? Grant looked at her. I don't know. The deed is in your desk, top right drawer, in the metal box. She'd seen it when she retrieved the survey maps. Go get it. Now. Daniel, go into town and find... She thought quickly. Find Sheriff Aldridge and bring him out here. Tell him you found trespassing evidence and you want it documented. The sheriff works with Crow, Daniel said. He said it with the blunt directness of a teenager who has been paying attention. Half the town says so. I know, Eleanor said. But if we document that we called the sheriff and show that he failed to act appropriately, that becomes part of the evidence record. She looked at Daniel directly. We're not calling him because we trust him. We're calling him because we need to show that we followed the proper process and what happened anyway. Daniel held her gaze for a moment. There was something in it, The particular evaluation of a young person deciding whether an adult can be trusted, which is one of the more serious assessments a human being performs. He nodded. He went. Grant came back from the house with the deed. Eleanor read it standing in the east pasture in the morning cold, the wind riffling the edges of the paper. The boundary was described from a granite outcropping. It was there in precise legal language. From the granite outcropping at the northeast corner, running due south 412 yards, thence west to the creek bed at its mean high water mark. Eleanor looked up from the paper and found the granite outcropping with her eyes. It was visible, 40 yards north. She looked at the stakes. She calculated. "The stakes are wrong," she said. "How wrong?" "They're on our land. The actual boundary is 12 feet east of where they've planted these." She handed him the deed. "But if Crow has filed an amended survey document with a different measurement from a different reference point, then there's a dispute. And disputes take time. And time is what he uses." "Yes." She looked down the line of orange stakes stretching away into the morning. "But if we have the original deed language and can demonstrate that the granite outcropping is the correct reference point, and if we have witness documentation of when these stakes appeared—" She stopped herself from running the whole chain of it out loud. Grant understood. He was looking at the stakes with the expression of a man who has identified the thing coming at him and is deciding how to meet it. "We pull them up," he said. "We document where they were. We keep them as evidence." "Yes, and we write to Whitmore today." She photographed the stakes' positions in her memory, distance from the fence line, spacing, the direction of the survey run, and when Grant came back with the spade, she made him wait while she drew the entire layout in her ledger, with measurements she paced off herself, her breath clouding in the cold air as she wrote. Then they pulled every stake out of the ground. Sheriff Aldridge came out that afternoon, as it turned out, earlier than they'd expected, which meant Daniel had been more persuasive than she'd anticipated, or the sheriff had his own reasons for arriving quickly. He was a large man who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who has been doing this job for a long time and has decided that deliberateness is its own form of authority. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the holes where the stakes had been, which Eleanor had photographed in her ledger. He looked at the stakes themselves, which Grant had arranged on the ground in their original configuration. "Could be a surveyor made an error," the sheriff said. "What surveyor, working for whom, and why was he on private land at night?" Eleanor said. She'd positioned herself beside Grant rather than behind him, which was a deliberate choice. Aldridge looked at her. "Mrs. Hart, Eleanor Hart." She met his eyes. "There are 12 feet between the established fence line and where these stakes were placed, Sheriff. The deed language is specific about the boundary reference. I'd like you to record this incident in your official log." "Ma'am, property boundary disputes are civil matters. Trespassing at night is not a civil matter," she said. "And the placement of false survey stakes on private land is not a civil matter either." She held his gaze. "I'd like it recorded. The date, the location, and the evidence present. That's all I'm asking." Aldridge looked at her. He looked at Grant. He looked at the stakes. He wrote it in his log. She watched him write it, reading the entry upside down with the practice of someone who had been reading upside-down documents for years, and confirmed that he'd included the specific details she needed. After he'd gone, Grant stood beside her in the cold afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a minute. "He'll tell Crow," Grant said. "I know." She gathered her ledger. "Crow will know we found them quickly, that we documented everything, and that we're not people who wait to see what happens next. Is that good?" She thought about it honestly. It might make him move faster. Men like Crow, when they feel a plan slipping, sometimes push harder rather than recalculating. She looked at the fence line, the clean ground where the stakes had been. If he pushes harder, he makes bigger mistakes. Bigger mistakes leave more evidence. "Or he does something worse," Grant said. "Yes." She didn't minimize it. "There's that too." The wind came across the east pasture and she pulled her coat tighter. Around them the land stretched out in every direction, gray-brown and still and immense. The kind of landscape that makes a person feel both insignificant and necessary at the same time. Eleanor had stopped fighting the size of the country. It was just the size of the country. She turned back toward the house. "I need to write to Whitmore, and I need to make supper." She paused. "Thomas mentioned he'd like beans again." "Did he really?" "No." She kept walking. He said he'd rather eat the fence posts, but we have beans and we have onions, and I have ideas for both of them. So beans it is. She heard behind her the short exhale that was Grant's version of a laugh. It was closer to an actual laugh than anything she'd heard from him in 3 months. She kept walking and let it happen behind her and didn't make anything of it, because some things grow better without being watched too closely. The letter to Whitmore went out that evening with 2 additional pages of documentation. The beans were, as it turned out, considerably better than fence posts, even by Thomas's revised assessment. Clara fell asleep before the dishes were done, as she usually did now, and Daniel carried her to bed without being asked, which was the kind of thing he'd started doing somewhere in the middle of March without anyone noticing exactly when it had become part of who he was. Grant washed the dishes that night. He'd started doing that a couple weeks back. He didn't make an announcement about it. He just picked up the cloth one evening and did them. And the next evening he did them again. And it had become a thing that happened in the Walker household now, quietly, without ceremony. Eleanor sat at the table with her ledger and made notes, and he stood at the basin with his back to her, washing dishes in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence doesn't require filling. Outside, the wind had picked up from the west. Somewhere across the east pasture, past the fence line, past the holes where the stakes had been, past the boundary Crow thought he was going to move 12 feet at a time until there was nothing left. Somewhere out there, the man was sitting in whatever rooms he occupied, making whatever calculations he made. Eleanor turned a page. She made her notes. She was not afraid. She was something else, something more useful than afraid. The feeling a person gets when they have finally located the shape of the thing coming at them and have decided, fully and without qualification, that they are not moving. The lamp burned between her hands. The house held. Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday in April, stepping off the billing stage with a leather satchel and the look of a man who had seen enough property disputes in his career to stop being surprised by the creative methods people use to steal from each other. He was smaller than Eleanor had pictured. Wiry, 60s, with sharp gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a quality of focused attention that she recognized and respected immediately. The quality of someone who listens not to respond, but to actually understand what's being said. He wore a good suit that had been good for a long time, not recently, and his boots were practical rather than impressive, which told her something useful about his priorities. She'd put out coffee and a plate of food before his wagon reached the lane. Grant had asked her that morning, with uncharacteristic nervousness that he was trying to keep out of his voice, whether she thought Whitmore would take the case. "I think he'll take it if the evidence holds up," she said. "And it holds up." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what I documented. Whether it's enough for a lawyer is his judgment, not mine." She'd poured the coffee. "Stop pacing." "I'm not pacing. You've walked past that window 4 times in 10 minutes. He'd sat down. Whitmore spent 2 hours at the kitchen table going through Eleanor's ledger and the supporting documents she'd organized. The original deed, the survey maps, the delivery invoices cross-referenced against the actual supply records, the incident log with dates and specifics, the letter confirming the Helena supplier's delivery quantities, the entry from Sheriff Aldridge's official log that she'd obtained a copy of from the county clerk's office 3 days after Aldridge's visit. He read everything twice. He asked questions, good questions, the kind that went sideways at the material rather than straight at it, testing the edges of what she knew and how she knew it. She answered everything directly and said plainly when she didn't know something rather than guessing, which seemed to satisfy him more than the answers themselves. At the end of 2 hours, he closed the ledger and looked at her over his glasses. "You compiled all of this?" he asked. "Yes." "You have a background in law?" "No, accounting, some. Mostly just attention." He looked at Grant. "You're a fortunate man." Grant, who was sitting across the table, said nothing, but something moved through his face that he covered by looking down at his coffee cup. "The Maddox brothers' invoicing is the cleanest piece of it," Whitmore said, opening the ledger again to the relevant pages. "That's potentially criminal fraud, not just civil. The survey stakes incident is strong as a harassment and trespass claim. The fence interference, harder to prove directly, but it establishes a pattern." He tapped the page. "The pattern is what matters here. One incident is misfortune. A pattern is a plan." "Can you take it?" Grant asked. Whitmore picked up his coffee, drank it, set the cup down. "I can take it. Contingency arrangement, as Mrs. Hart described in her letter. I'll need 6 weeks to prepare filings and approach the territorial court in Helena. He looked at Eleanor. In the meantime, you continue documenting everything, every incident, every supply discrepancy, every time someone comes onto this property without invitation. Already doing it, she said. I know. Keep doing it. He stood, gathering the copies she'd made for him. One more thing. Crow will know I've been here before I get back to Billings. This town doesn't have a secret smaller than a house fire. He looked at them both. When he knows, he'll push harder. That's what men like him do. Be ready for it. We've been discussing that, Grant said. Good. Then we have a place to start. He picked up his satchel. I'll be in contact by the end of the month. After Whitmore's wagon left the lane, Eleanor and Grant stood on the porch in the April afternoon. The first real warmth of the year was in the air. Not summer, but the preliminary suggestion of it, the temperature finding its way back up from the floor of winter. 6 weeks, Grant said. 6 weeks, she agreed. A lot can happen in 6 weeks. Yes. She looked out at the ranch, the barn, the pastures, the fence line in the east where the holes had long since settled over and the grass was beginning to green back. But we knew that. She went inside to start dinner, and Grant went to the barn, and the ranch turned with its usual indifference to human plans and human hopes, and the 6 weeks began. They were right that a lot could happen. The first thing that happened was Margaret Doyle. Margaret Doyle had owned a small homestead 6 miles south of Black Ridge until 14 months ago, when she'd lost it to what she'd understood as accumulated debt, 2 bad seasons, and simple bad luck. She was in her 50s, a widow, and she'd been living since then in a single room above the laundry in town, taking in mending work for anyone who'd give it to her. Eleanor met her at the dry goods store on a Wednesday and recognized something in her face that she had learned to recognize, the particular expression of someone who has been through something that diminished them without their consent and hasn't yet found their way back to themselves. She introduced herself. Margaret knew who she was. Everyone in Black Ridge knew who Eleanor was by now, in the way small towns know things they've collectively decided to have opinions about. I heard you're fighting Crow, Margaret said. She said it quietly, with the careful deniability of someone who has learned that being associated with the wrong side of a powerful man's plans can cost you things you can't afford to lose. We're pursuing legal remedy for documented fraud on the Walker property, Eleanor said, which was both accurate and the version she was comfortable saying out loud in a public store. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said just as quietly, "The hay barn fire. The one that cost me my West Pasture hay in October, 2 winters ago. They said it was an accident. Did you believe that? I believed what I was told because I didn't have the money or the energy not to." She was folding the paper around her purchase as she spoke, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done small, careful things to keep from falling apart for a long time. But I remembered afterward that the fire started on the side facing the road, and nobody uses that side of the barn in October. Eleanor looked at her. Would you be willing to speak with an attorney named Whitmore? To tell him what you've told me? The fear that crossed Margaret's face was real, and she didn't pretend it wasn't. If Crow knows I've talked, he'll likely know, Eleanor said honestly. I won't tell you otherwise. She met the older woman's eyes. But here's what I know, Margaret. He's already taken everything you had. He has nothing left to threaten you with except fear itself, and fear is the cheapest thing he has. Margaret was quiet, looking at the wrapped parcel in her hands. The Morrison family, she said finally, and the Becketts. They'll tell you the same things if you ask them the right way. The Becketts especially. Their water rights dispute had Crow's name on it from the beginning. Any fool could see it. She looked up. You didn't hear any of this from me. I didn't hear a word, Eleanor said. And then, come to the ranch on Saturday. Bring what you remember. Write it down if you can, whatever specific dates and incidents you recall. Whitmore needs specifics. Margaret left the store without confirming she'd come. She showed up at the Walker Ranch gate on Saturday morning with a folded piece of paper in her hand and the look of someone who has made a decision they're not fully sure about and have decided to live with it anyway. Eleanor made coffee and sat with her at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The paper had 17 specific incidents on it, dated and described, covering 14 months before Margaret lost her property. Reading it, Eleanor felt the familiar cold clarity that came when a pattern resolved itself fully, the clarity of something that had always been there becoming finally visible. "This is good work, Margaret," she said. Margaret looked at the paper like she was seeing it from a distance. "It was a good property. I built it myself after my husband died. 8 years." She paused. "He took 8 years and 18 months. Eleanor covered the older woman's hand with her own. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would be enough. And she'd learned a long time ago that insufficient words do more damage than honest silence. She wrote to Whitmore that evening with Margaret's account attached. 3 days later, she drove the wagon to the Beckett homestead, what was left of it, a leased property now, with a family living in 2 rooms of what used to be a full house, and spent an afternoon with Nathan Beckett, who was 56 and had the permanently surprised expression of a man who had been ambushed by life and hadn't fully processed it yet. Nathan Beckett talked for 2 hours. He had a great deal to say that he'd never said to anyone, because no one had come and sat in his kitchen and asked. The Morrison family was harder. They'd moved to Billings and weren't coming back, and Eleanor sent them a letter through Whitmore's office that was careful in its language and honest in its purpose. 3 weeks after Whitmore's visit, they had 4 additional witness accounts and a set of overlapping incident records that described, when laid together, a deliberate and systematic campaign of sabotage across 6 properties over 4 years. Crow had been doing this longer than Eleanor had thought. He had been doing this much longer. She sat with that knowledge for one evening and felt the weight of all the people who had lost things they'd spent their lives building, and she let herself feel it because she thought it was important to feel it rather than turn it immediately into something useful. All those years, all those families. Then she got up and kept working. The push came in May. Whitmore had warned them it would. Crow was too smart not to see the walls going up around him, and men like Crow did not wait to be boxed in. It started with the loan. The bank in Black Ridge sent a letter on the 3rd of May informing Grant Walker that due to a review of outstanding accounts, the terms of his operating loan had been modified and full repayment of the remaining balance was required within 30 days rather than the original schedule extending to November. Grant read the letter at the kitchen table with an expression that was almost completely flat, which Eleanor had learned was what his face did when something hit him in a place he'd already been hit. "They can't do that," Daniel said. He'd been at the table doing his schoolwork when the letter arrived and had read it over his father's shoulder without apology. "They can if there's the clause in the original agreement," Eleanor said. She was already reaching for the loan documents from the metal box. She found the relevant section in under a minute because she'd read these documents 3 times and knew where everything was. She read the clause. She read it again. She set the paper down. "There is a clause," she said, "but it specifies that modification of terms requires 45 days' notice and documentation of default or material change in financial position." She looked at Grant. "You're not in default? The April payment went. Have there been any changes to your registered assets or liabilities since you signed this agreement?" "No." "Then the 30-day notice is not valid under the terms of the agreement." She wrote the specific clause reference at the top of a fresh ledger page. "We write to Whitmore today. This is potentially bank fraud layered on top of everything else, and the Territorial Banking Commission has its own oversight process separate from the county court." "The Banking Commission in Helena," Grant said. "Yes." "Where Crow also has connections." "Probably." She looked at him levelly. "We file anyway. We file everything everywhere it can be filed so that he has to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. A man defending himself in 4 directions at once makes mistakes he wouldn't make if he only had one direction to worry about." Grant looked at the bank letter. "And if the loan gets called despite all of it?" She didn't minimize it. "Then we deal with that when it happens." But it hasn't happened yet. The letter to Whitmore went out before noon. 3 days later, a man named Rudd, no first name offered, no explanation of who he worked for, though Eleanor didn't need one, appeared at the ranch gate and asked to speak with Mrs. Hart specifically, not Grant. Eleanor. She went to the gate. She left the gate closed between them. Rudd was maybe 40, with the sun-worn look of a man who'd spent decades outdoors doing whatever was asked of him. He had the particular quality of blankness she'd noticed in the 2 men who'd ridden with Crow in March, the professional absence of expression that some men develop when they've decided that having a face costs too much. "Mr. Crow has asked me to convey something," he said. Then convey it, she said. He says you're a smart woman. He says you understand how things work in a territory like this, where a man with resources and patience can outlast almost any legal process. He was reciting it, not quite verbatim, but close. He says that if you were to encourage Mr. Walker to accept a fair market offer for the property and move on, there would be no reason for any of this to become harder than it's already been. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. He looked back. He was doing his job, and they both knew it. "Tell Mr. Crow," she said, "that I grew up watching a man with resources and patience take my father's land, and that I've had 43 years to think about what I would do differently if I ever found myself in that situation again." She held his gaze. "I know exactly what I'd do differently. Tell him that." Rudd looked at her. Something moved behind the blankness. Not sympathy, exactly. Something more like the recognition of one person by another, across a significant difference in the situations they occupied. "Ma'am," he said. He touched the brim of his hat, which was not nothing. He turned the horse and rode back down the road. Eleanor stood at the gate and watched him go, and she thought about her father standing in his yard watching different men go, watching everything he'd built go with them, and she let the distance between that moment and this one be as large as it actually was. Then she went back to the house. "Who was that?" Grant asked from the barn doorway. "A messenger," she said. "Crow offered us a way out." Grant went still. "And?" "I declined." She kept walking. "I need to write to Whitmore again." The fire came on a Thursday night in late May, 6 weeks and 2 days after Whitmore's visit, with a spring storm that had been building since midday. Eleanor had watched the weather all afternoon, the way the clouds were stacking from the southwest, the particular green tinge at the horizon that she'd grown up knowing meant the storm intended to be serious. She'd said at supper that the night was going to be bad, and they should make sure the barn was fully secured. She was in her room, not yet asleep, when she smelled it. The smell of fire is different from the smell of a stove or a lamp. It's the same element but a different message, and a person who has ever been close to a fire that was out of control develops an immediate biological response to the distinction that bypasses thinking entirely. Eleanor was at her window in the time it took to process the smell, and she looked out at the dark yard and saw the orange light pulsing from the direction of the feed barn. She was dressed and at Daniel's door in under 30 seconds. "Fire," she said. "Feed barn, get up." She was already moving when she heard him land on the floor. The rain had started. Real rain, not the preliminary spitting of the earlier hour, but the heavy, purposeful rain of a storm that had arrived meaning business. It hit Eleanor as she came off the porch like a cold wall, soaking through her coat in seconds. She didn't slow down. The feed barn was the smaller of the two outbuildings, positioned northeast of the main barn, and it was burning from the bottom of the south-facing wall, which was, she registered this in a fraction of a second, the wall facing away from the lightning direction. Grant was already there. He'd come from the main barn where he'd gone to check the horses when the storm started, and he was at the feed barn's side door with a bucket that was hopelessly insufficient. "Grant!" She grabbed his arm. He turned. It started from the south wall. He looked at her. The rain and the fire were competing across his face. "Lightning would come from the other side," she said. It was set. 3 seconds of both of them standing in the rain, in the fire's orange light, processing that. The feed barn had hay inside. The hay would go fast. And the main barn was 30 yards northeast, close enough that if the fire jumped with the wind, and the wind was gusting and unpredictable in the storm, they'd lose the horses and possibly the main structure. And the main barn shared a wall with the equipment shed. And if the equipment shed went, the equipment shed, Grant said. He was seeing it too. If the shed burns, the fire has a clear path to the house. She was already moving, calculating, working the angles the way she worked every problem, methodically, in the real conditions available, not the ideal ones. "We can't save the feed barn. The rain might slow the spread, but not stop it." She turned to Grant. "We need to demolish the equipment shed." He stared at her. "Eleanor, create a gap. No fuel between the main barn and the house. If we take the shed down now and drag the material clear, the fire has nothing to bridge to." She met his eyes. "The shed is equipment and lumber. The main barn is horses and the winter supply structure. The house is the children. The shed is $800 of, I know what it's worth." She was already walking toward it. "What's the house worth?" She heard him behind her, not arguing anymore, which was the only answer that mattered. Daniel appeared from the house with Thomas behind him, and Eleanor intercepted Thomas at the yard edge. "Take Clara," she said. "Both of you go to the McGuire farm. Do you know the way?" "Yes, but—" "Thomas, look at me." He did. He was 7 years old, and his face was wet from the rain, and the fire was reflected in his eyes, and he was trying very hard not to be scared. "You're going to take your sister to the McGuire farm, and you're going to tell Mr. McGuire what's happening, and you're going to stay there. That's the most important job on this ranch tonight. Can you do it?" "Yes," he said. 7 years old. She believed him completely. "Go, now." She turned before she could watch them go, because watching them go would have taken something out of her that she needed. Daniel was already at the equipment shed with a pry bar in his hands. He was 14 and strong and terrified and working anyway, which was the bravest form of courage Eleanor knew. She went to the other side of the shed wall and found the axe that hung on the exterior bracket and started on the structural support nearest the feed barn. Grant worked beside her on the connecting wall. The three of them, in the rain and the fire's light, dismantling what they'd built. Not elegantly, not cleanly, but fast, because fast was what the situation required. The rain intensified. A gust hit from the northwest and the feed barn's roof took it and shed a cascade of burning material into the yard between the buildings. And Eleanor felt the heat on the left side of her face like a hand pressed flat against her skin. "Back corner post!" Daniel shouted over the rain. She moved to the corner post and hit it twice, and felt it give and hit it again, and it came loose at the base, and the wall section sagged outward. Grant caught the top edge, and they heaved it outward together. She felt her shoulder scream in objection and ignored it. And the wall section went down into the mud, and the rain started on it immediately. The gap was maybe 15 feet. 15 feet of cleared, wet ground between the feed barn's reach and the main barn's wall. Grant was breathing hard. Eleanor was breathing harder. Daniel was standing with the pry bar in both hands, looking at the gap, looking at the fire, looking at them. "Is it enough?" he asked. "I think so," Eleanor said. She wasn't certain. Certainty wasn't available. "We need to keep water on the main barn's south wall. Wet wood doesn't catch." They ran water from the well pump for the next hour and a half. It was Eleanor and Grant and Daniel taking turns at the pump and at the wall with the buckets, in the rain that was both helping and not helping, in the wind that kept shifting and had to be watched constantly. The feed barn burned. It burned completely. There was nothing left to save, and they didn't try. But the fire didn't jump the gap. The rain and the wet wall and the 15 feet of cleared ground between held the line. At some point past midnight, the fire ran out of fuel and the rain finished what was left, and the feed barn was gone, and the main barn stood, and the house behind it stood, and the three of them stood in the mud of the yard and looked at what had happened. Eleanor had burn marks on her left coat sleeve and a cut on her right hand that she hadn't felt during the work and was noticing now. Her boots were saturated through. She was cold in the specific way of someone who has been soaked to the bone in cold rain for 2 hours. Grant's face, when she looked at him, had the stripped-down quality of a man who has had everything reduced to the essential by a long, frightening night and is standing in what's left. "The children," he said. "Safe at McGuire's. Thomas got them there." She was certain of this, or as certain as she could be. Thomas had looked at her with the eyes of someone who understood the assignment. Daniel sat down in the mud. Just sat down, because his legs decided it was time. He had the pry bar across his knees, and he was looking at the ruin of the feed barn with the exhausted, wrung-out look of someone who has just found out what they're made of and is still processing the information. Grant looked at his son. Something crossed his face that Eleanor looked away from because it was private. The look of a father seeing his child on the other side of something difficult and feeling the full measure of all of it at once. The fear and the pride and the grief underneath everything, and the love holding it all in one place. She walked to the pump and ran water over her right hand and looked at the cut, which was longer than ideal, but not deep enough to be serious. She wrapped it in the cloth she kept in her coat pocket. She'd kept a cloth there since January, because January had taught her that this was useful, and stood for a moment with her back to the yard. She was thinking about the south wall, the side facing away from the lightning, the fire that had started from a wall that made no natural sense to start from. They'd document it in the morning. She'd bring Grant and Daniel back to look at the base of that wall in daylight, and she'd write down everything she saw, and it would go to Whitmore with everything else. And it would become one more piece of the record that was slowly, carefully, building into something that a territorial court would have to look at seriously. She turned back around. Grant was standing in the middle of the yard, in the rain that was finally lightening toward drizzle, and he was looking at her with an expression that she didn't have a name for. Not the rapid assessment of November, not the complicated grief and gratitude of December, something older and more specific than either of those things. The look of a man who has been standing next to someone through something genuinely terrible and has noticed, in the middle of all of it, who that person is. "Eleanor," he said. Her name in his voice had a different weight than it used to. She'd been noticing this for a while. "We should get inside," she said. "The temperature's dropping." "I know." He didn't move. He stopped. He tried again. "I don't know how to say the thing I'm trying to say." "You don't have to say it tonight," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "No," he said, "but I'm going to." The rain had thinned to almost nothing. Somewhere in the dark, past the ruined feed barn, the Montana night was enormous and cold and indifferent to everything that had just happened, the way it always was. Eleanor looked back at Grant Walker, standing in the mud of his own yard in the diminishing rain, and she thought about all the ways the night could have gone differently and didn't. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. Daniel needs to get warm." She walked to the porch. She heard Grant say something to Daniel, brief and low. She heard Daniel get up from the mud. She went inside and built up the stove and put the water on and stood in the kitchen in her wet clothes and let herself feel, for exactly the time it took the water to boil, how close all of it had come. The house, the barn, the children. All of it on a 15-foot margin of cleared ground and 3 people who had worked without stopping because stopping wasn't an option. The water boiled. She made the coffee. The morning after this fire had the particular quality of mornings that follow terrible nights. Everything too bright, too quiet, the world going about its ordinary business with complete indifference to what had just happened in it. Eleanor was up before dawn. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours, and those 2 hours had been the shallow, vigilant kind that leave a person more tired than if they'd simply stayed awake. She built the kitchen fire, put water on, and stood at the window watching the gray light come up over the yard and the ruined shell of the feed barn, which in daylight looked smaller than it had felt in the dark. Burned structures always looked smaller in daylight. The fear was bigger than the thing. Grant came down the stairs at first light. He looked like a man who had been awake all night pretending to sleep, which was exactly what he was. He sat at the table without a word, and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him with her own. They looked at each other. "I want to walk the south wall before anything else gets moved," she said. "I was thinking the same thing." He wrapped both hands around the cup. His knuckles were scraped. She'd noticed this the night before, hadn't said anything. "Daniel's still asleep." "Let him sleep." She looked at her own hands. The cut on her right palm had stiffened overnight, pulling when she flexed her fingers. "Thomas and Clara are still at McGuire's. I'll drive out to get them after we've looked at the wall." Grant nodded. The morning was cold and smelled of wet ash and the particular sharpness of burned wood that had been rained on, which was one of the grimmer smells Eleanor knew. They crossed the yard together and stood at what remained of the south wall of the feed barn, the wall that had started it, the wall facing away from where lightning would have struck if lightning had been the cause. The base of the wall was gone, of course, burned through to the ground. But around the exterior, at the bottom where the fire had originated, the soil told a story that fire tried its best to erase and didn't quite manage. Eleanor crouched and looked without touching anything. There was a pattern in the soil, a slight discoloration, a radius of ground burn that spread outward from a specific point rather than upward from a wider base. She'd seen this before, or something like it, in a book on fire investigation she'd read 8 years ago in the library of a household she'd worked for, belonging to a man who had suspected arson on an adjacent property and had educated himself thoroughly on the subject. She'd read it because it was there, and she read most things that were there. "The origin point is right here," she said, indicating without touching. "You can see where the ground burned outward rather than down from the wall. If it had started from inside, from hay catching on a spark, the burn pattern would be different. It would come from inside out." She looked up at Grant. Someone placed an accelerant against the outside of this wall. Grant crouched beside her. He looked at what she was looking at. She watched him see it. "We need Whitmore here," he said. "I wrote him last night, before I slept." She'd done it by lamplight at 2 a.m, her burned sleeve still damp, her right hand wrapped. "I described the wall, the origin point, the storm conditions, the directional logic of lightning versus a set fire. He'll know what to do with it." Grant was quiet, looking at the ground. "They could have killed us," he said. Not with anger. He'd moved past anger into something colder. "The children were in that house." "I know. If the gap hadn't held, I know, Grant." He stood up. He stood very still for a moment, the way he did when he was containing something large and deciding what shape to let it out in. "This ends," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "It does." She stood up beside him, and they both looked at the burned wall, and the decision between them was as solid as the granite outcropping on the northeast corner, as fixed as the deed language that described it. Some decisions don't need to be spoken at length. They just need to be reached. They walked back to the house together. Whitmore arrived from Billings 4 days later, and he brought with him something Eleanor hadn't anticipated, a man named Cord, who turned out to be a fire investigator the territorial court in Helena used on arson cases. Cord was 50s, quiet, methodical in the way of someone who has spent decades making evidence visible that people have tried hard to make invisible. He spent 3 hours at the south wall of the ruined feed barn, made his own diagrams, collected soil samples in glass jars, and at the end of it gave Whitmore a look that was its own form of professional confirmation. "Intentional," Cord said, when Eleanor asked him directly. "The pattern is consistent with an accelerant applied to the exterior wall base. Given the storm conditions, whoever said it was counting on the weather to complicate the investigation." "Would a territorial court accept that assessment?" she asked. "With my documentation and the soil samples, yes." He looked at the ruin. "I've seen this 4 times in 15 years. Different properties, different circumstances. It's a method people use when they think weather gives them cover." He closed his case. "It doesn't." Whitmore sat with Eleanor and Grant for 2 hours after Cord left. The case file that had started as 41 pages in Eleanor's ledger had grown, with the Margaret Doyle account, the Beckett testimony, the Morrison family's written statement, the bank loan modification attempt, the arson investigation, into something that Whitmore described with the measured language of a man who doesn't make promises but is very close to making one. "The territorial court in Helena has agreed to an expedited hearing," he said, 6 weeks out. "The arson finding changes the classification of everything else. It moves this from civil property fraud into criminal conspiracy territory, which means the territorial prosecutor's office becomes involved. They have resources I don't." "Will they use them?" Grant asked. He'd learned, Eleanor noticed, to ask the practical questions directly rather than hoping for the best. "The prosecutor assigned to this district is a man named Albright. He's been looking for a case that could stick to Crow for 2 years. Whitmore sorted his papers. "He's been watching, but he didn't have enough. Now he might." He looked at Eleanor specifically. "The documentation you've compiled, the pattern evidence, is what makes this viable. Without that, each incident is isolated and explicable. With it, the jury sees a design." "How long until Crow knows about the prosecutor's involvement?" Eleanor asked. "He probably already suspects. He has people at the county level." Whitmore's expression was flat and factual. "Which means the next few weeks are the most dangerous period. Men in his position, when they see the legal structure going up around them, make decisions they wouldn't make if they were calm." "He'll come for the ranch again," Daniel said. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting at the kitchen table's end, which he'd taken to doing during these conversations, not asking to be included, just positioning himself as included, which Eleanor had decided some time ago was his right. He was 15 in June. He'd pulled walls down in a fire and kept his head clear doing it. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Probably." "Then we should be ready for him." "That's exactly what we're going to be," she said. What being ready looked like, in practical terms, was this. Eleanor wrote letters to the neighboring ranchers who remained, the Hendricks family, the Pattersons, old Abe Fowler, whose property abutted theirs on the west, explaining in plain language without legal embellishment what had been documented and what was coming, not asking for anything specific, just sharing the information and letting people make their own decisions about what it meant for them. She did not know if anyone would respond. All three of them did, within a week. Ub Fowler came himself, rode over on a Tuesday morning on a horse that was nearly as old as he was, and sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and listened to everything Eleanor laid out, and at the end said, "I told Martha 10 years ago there was something wrong about how Crow got the Kimball place. She said I was being difficult." He set his cup down. "I'm going to write Martha a letter from my grave someday and just put 'I told you so' in it and nothing else." Eleanor almost laughed. She managed not to. "Would you testify to what you know about the Kimball acquisition?" "Hell yes, I would." He picked his hat up off the table. "What do you need me to do?" She told him. The Hendricks sent their eldest son, a young man of 22 named Cal, who had his mother's directness and a memory for specific dates and incidents that proved genuinely useful. He'd been present for conversations between his father and Crow's men that he'd never thought much of at the time, and now laid against the pattern Eleanor spread on the table for him, took on a different and specific significance. "Crow's man offered my father 20 cents on the dollar for the East Quarter," Cal said. "Said the land was marginal. My father knew the land wasn't marginal. 2 weeks later, the East Quarter fencing went down in a storm, and we lost 40 head. He made the quotation marks with his voice rather than his hands, the way people do when the falseness of an explanation has finally resolved itself into certainty. My father took the offer after the second incident. We've been trying to buy that land back ever since. By the end of June, Whitmore had 7 witness accounts. The territorial prosecutor had 5. The bank investigation, triggered by Whitmore's filing about the illegal loan modification attempt, had opened its own inquiry, which had the side effect of making the bank's president extremely cooperative in ways he hadn't been when he thought Crow's interests and his own were aligned. People, Eleanor had observed over the course of her life, were frequently loyal to power right up until the point where loyalty stopped being profitable. It wasn't admirable, but it was consistent, and consistency could be used. The ranch ran through June on a combination of the spring calves beginning to move, the cash from McGuire's hay purchase that Daniel had managed with impressive self-possession, and the contributions of the neighboring families, who had started rotating through the property in what nobody formally called a watch schedule, but which functioned as one: someone's wagon on the road within sight of the ranch gate most evenings, someone's lamp in a window. It was the Hendricks' wife, Martha. Not the same Martha as Abe Fowler's, a different Martha. This territory had a surplus of Marthas, who organized it without being asked and without announcing that she'd organized it, which was the most effective way to organize most things. Eleanor noticed this and noted it, and thought not for the first time that the valley had more capable women than it had ever given itself credit for. "You should come to the ranch socials again," Martha Hendricks told Eleanor one afternoon when she'd stopped to leave a plate of food and information in roughly equal measure. "You haven't been?" "I've been busy." "Everyone's been busy." Martha looked at her with the direct assessment of a woman who has been looking at other women clearly for 50 years. "They talk about you, you know, the women in town." "I know. It's different than it was in February." Martha adjusted the plate she was holding. "The fire changed it. People saw what you did, what all 3 of you did." She paused. "They don't know exactly what to do with you. You don't fit the shape they had ready." Eleanor looked at her. "I never did." "No." Martha said it without apology or pity. "But that's their problem to work out, not yours." She handed over the plate. "Good beans last time, by the way. Different than I make them. Different spice. Better. Don't tell my husband." She left, and Eleanor stood on the porch with the plate and felt something settle. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet shift of something that had been at an angle for a long time coming a few degrees closer to level. The men came on a Sunday night in early July, 3 of them. Eleanor heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses approaching the gate at a pace that was too slow to be purposeful travel and too deliberate to be accident. She'd been sitting up late, as she often did, and she'd developed over the months at Walker Ranch the same kind of alertness to the sounds of the property that she suspected Grant had always had and had lost somewhere in the worst of his grief. She heard the horses. She went to the window. She saw the shapes of 3 riders at the gate in the thin light of a quarter moon. She woke Grant first, quietly, in the way they'd agreed she would if anything happened at night. Then she went to Daniel's room and knocked once and said, "Riders at the gate," and heard him land on the floor before the words finished. Then she went to the kitchen and took the rifle from the cabinet above the door, a Winchester repeater that she'd asked Grant to show her in April and had practiced with on a Saturday afternoon in the far pasture until she was comfortable with it. Not expert, comfortable. Grant came into the kitchen dressed and carrying his own rifle. 3, she said. I counted. He looked at her rifle. He didn't say anything about it. They went out the back and came around the side of the house to approach the gate from the yard rather than straight down the porch steps, which put the house behind them instead of beside them. Daniel came behind them, and Grant glanced back and looked like he wanted to tell his son to stay inside, and said nothing because Daniel was 15 and had earned his place on this property in the dark of a burning night. The 3 riders had come through the gate. They were in the yard now, and one of them had a torch. Not lit yet, which meant they were still in the preliminary phase of whatever this was. Which meant there was still time. Eleanor stepped out from the side of the house into the yard where the moonlight reached. "Stop where you are," she said. Her voice carried in the quiet night with more authority than she'd expected from herself. Adrenaline, probably. The voice you get when you stop being afraid of what happens if you speak and start being afraid of what happens if you don't. The 3 riders stopped. The horses shifted. Grant came out beside her. Daniel flanked his other side. The man with the torch, biggest of the 3, on a dark horse, looked at them. "We have a message from Mr. Crow," he said. "We've had enough of Mr. Crow's messages," Eleanor said. "Put the torch down." "Ma'am, sus, that's not a request." She raised the rifle. Her heart was beating hard enough that she could feel it in the hand gripping the stock. She kept the barrel level. "Put it down, then get off this property and go back to whoever sent you and tell him it didn't work. None of it worked. And the men who burned that barn are going to be in front of a territorial judge in 5 weeks, and if any of you were involved in that, the same is going to apply to you." The man with the torch looked at Grant, looked at Daniel, looked back at Eleanor. There was a moment, one of those moments that hinges, where everything depended on a decision being made by someone she didn't know, for reasons she could only estimate. A long, cold, quiet moment in the dark of the yard. The torch went down. It hit the dirt and lay there, unlit, harmless. The 3 riders looked at each other with the specific communication of men who have been sent to do something and have found the situation different than they were told it would be. The man in the middle said something low to the others that Eleanor didn't catch. Then he turned his horse. The other 2 followed. They rode back through the gate. The yard was quiet. Eleanor lowered the rifle. Her hands were not quite steady. She let them be not quite steady and didn't make anything of it. "You all right?" Grant asked. "Yes." She looked at the torch lying in the dirt. "Let's make sure they actually leave." Daniel was already at the gate, watching the riders diminish into the dark of the road. "They're not stopping," he said. "Good." They stood at the gate, the 3 of them, until the sound of hooves faded entirely. The Montana night was immense around them. Stars, distance, the smell of summer grass, and somewhere the faint char of the ruined feed barn that the air still carried when the wind came from that direction. "We should document this tonight," Eleanor said, "while the details are clear." Eleanor. Grant's voice had the weight in it that she'd been hearing more often lately, the specific weight of someone carrying something they've been deciding whether to put down. She turned. He was looking at her in the moonlight with the expression she'd first seen the night of the fire. The stripped-down version of him that the crisis had produced and that hadn't fully returned behind its usual composure afterward. She'd noticed this, the way the fire had changed his face slightly, the way some of the careful management had come down and not fully gone back up. "After this is finished," he said, "when Whitmore's done and the court's done and all of it, I want to talk to you about something." "All right," she said. "Not tonight." "I know." She looked at him a moment longer. "Go check the barn. Make sure they didn't do anything before we came out." He went. She stayed at the gate for another minute, looking at the road, and then went inside to write down everything she'd seen. The torch went into her evidence log at 11:17 in the evening. Make, approximate length, the lack of ignition material present, the 3 riders' general descriptions, the direction of their departure. All of it, in her precise tight hand, dated and timed. Whitmore got the letter 3 days later. By the time the territorial court hearing opened in Helena on the 14th of August, the case file that went before the judge was 4 inches thick. The prosecutor's office had added 30 pages of financial investigation to Eleanor's original documentation. The arson investigator's report was in there. 7 witness accounts, including Margaret Doyle's, which she had given in a small courthouse office with her hands folded on the table and her voice steady in a way that Eleanor suspected had cost her something. Sterling Crow arrived at the courthouse with 2 attorneys and the expression of a man who is accustomed to courtrooms going his way because he's arranged for them to. Eleanor and Grant sat in the gallery. Daniel had stayed at the ranch with Thomas and Clara. He'd wanted to come, and Eleanor had told him honestly that someone responsible needed to be home, and had watched him process the compliment inside the responsibility and accept both. The hearing lasted 2.5 days. Eleanor had never been inside a territorial courtroom before. She'd expected it to be more dramatic, raised voices, theatrical confrontation, the kind of scene that her limited experience with courtrooms, absorbed from newspapers and secondhand accounts, had led her to anticipate. What it was, instead, was quieter and more methodical, and in some ways more devastating for being so. Evidence presented in sequence, witness accounts read into the record, numbers cross-referenced against records that Crow's own attorney had tried to exclude and failed, because Whitmore had built the foundation of each document's admissibility before anyone tried to pull them. The pattern, laid out in sequence by a prosecutor who had clearly been waiting for this opportunity, was plainly visible. There was no version of it that looked like coincidence. Across 4 years and 6 properties, across supply fraud and physical sabotage and financial manipulation, and the arson of a working family's barn on a stormy night in May, the same hand was present. Crow's attorneys made arguments. Some of them were technically good arguments. They didn't move the fundamental arithmetic of what was documented. On the morning of the 3rd day, the judge, a gray-haired woman named Hargrove, who had been on the territorial bench for 11 years, and had the expression of someone who had heard most of what humans were capable of and was rarely surprised, read the ruling into the record. She read it in the particular flat, careful language of formal legal decisions that doesn't make anything smaller by dramatizing it. Injunction against further activities. Criminal referral on arson, fraud, and conspiracy charges. Asset freeze pending full financial investigation. Restitution ordered to 5 former property owners. The Walker Ranch's eastern boundary confirmed as the original deed described, 12 feet east of where Crow's stakes had been placed. Eleanor looked at her hands in her lap when the ruling finished. She heard Grant exhale beside her. The specific sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. She kept looking at her hands. The cut on her right palm had healed to a thin scar. She'd stopped noticing it most of the time. Outside the courthouse, in the August heat of Helena's main street, Whitmore shook their hands. "The criminal charges will proceed separately," he said. "That process will take time, but the injunction is immediate. He cannot touch the ranch. He cannot approach the property. He cannot conduct any transaction involving the properties in question." He paused. "It's done, as much as these things are ever done." "The other families," Eleanor said. "The restitution. The process takes time, but it's ordered. Hargrove doesn't make orders she doesn't intend to enforce." He looked at them both. "You should go home." Grant looked at Eleanor. "Let's go home," she said. The drive back from Helena took most of a day, the wagon moving through summer brown Montana landscape that looked different than it had looked in February, in the way all things look different once you've been through enough with them. Less threatening. Not smaller, just familiar in a way that wasn't there before. They didn't talk much on the drive. They didn't need to. There was a quality to the silence between them that had changed over the course of the months. It had become a comfortable silence. Not an empty one. The silence of 2 people who have said enough important things that the quiet between is restful rather than uncertain. At one point, somewhere on the stretch of road between 2 long ridges, Grant said, "I should have believed you sooner, when you first showed me the ledger." "You believed me when you'd seen enough to be sure," she said. "That's not a character flaw. It costs time." "We had enough time." She looked at the road ahead. "We made it enough." He was quiet again. "What I said the other night," he said after a while, "about wanting to talk to you about something. You said after all this was finished, it's finished enough." He kept his eyes on the road. The horse moved at its steady pace, indifferent to human conversations and their difficulties. "I want you to stay." "I am staying," she said. "I mean—" He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man comfortable with imprecision. He liked things the way she liked them, stated clearly with accurate measurements from the correct reference point. "I mean, I want you to stay as my wife, not as a housekeeper, not as an arrangement." He paused. "You don't have to answer now." "Grant." "I mean it. Take whatever time." "Grant." She waited until he looked at her. "I know what you mean. I've known what you meant for a while." He held her gaze. His hands on the reins were still. "And?" he said. She looked at the road ahead, the long Montana road with the mountains in the far distance and the afternoon light going gold across the grassland and the ranch somewhere ahead of them. Her kitchen and her ledger and the fence line she could walk in the dark by now without a lamp, and the 3 children who had taught themselves to expect her there and had stopped somewhere along the way, expecting her not to be. "Ask me properly," she said. "When we're home." He looked back at the road. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. The horse moved. The road opened ahead. She didn't look at him, but she was aware of him beside her the way you're aware of something solid when you've been standing in uncertain ground for a long time. Not a rescue, not a solution to anything, just the specific, unmistakable fact of someone who is there. The ranch came into view at the end of the long lane as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and she could see the lamp already burning in the kitchen window, which meant Daniel had put it there. And it was the most ordinary sight she could think of, and it was exactly right. The lamp in the kitchen window was Daniel's doing, as she'd suspected. He was at the stove when they came in, turning something in a skillet with the focused concentration of a person who has recently decided that cooking is a skill worth acquiring and has not yet made peace with the learning curve. Thomas was at the table doing arithmetic with the particular expression of a child performing arithmetic under protest. Clara was on the floor with her cloth rabbit and 3 other objects that had been recruited into some game whose rules existed entirely in her own imagination. The ordinary completeness of it stopped Eleanor in the doorway for a half second, just a half second, not long enough for anyone to notice. Then she hung up her coat and went to see what Daniel was burning. "It's not burning," he said, defensive. "It's close." She adjusted the pan's position on the stove without taking it from him. "Lower heat. You want it to cook, not punish." He moved it. "How'd it go?" "It went well." She got down a second pan and started on the rest of the meal. "Whitmore will write with the formal details, but the injunction's been issued." Thomas looked up from his arithmetic. "Does that mean Crow can't bother us anymore?" "It means he can't touch the property and can't conduct business involving the valley lands." She cracked eggs into the pan. "The criminal charges will take longer. Courts take time." "How much longer?" "Months. Possibly more." She looked at him. "But the immediate threat is gone. The ranch is protected." Thomas considered this with the pragmatic thoroughness of a 7-year-old who has learned that adults sometimes give answers that need to be interrogated. "So we're okay?" "We're okay," she said. He went back to his arithmetic, apparently satisfied, which was one of the more touching forms of trust Eleanor had encountered. Grant had gone to the barn to see to the horses and came back in when supper was nearly done, and the 5 of them ate together at the kitchen table in the ordinary way they'd been eating together for months, the conversation moving through the day's events on the ranch, a calf that had gotten through the fence, a section of roof on the main barn that needed attention before fall, and the table noise of people who live in each other's company and have stopped performing for each other. After the children were in bed, Grant and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, the particular nighttime quiet of the house. She waited. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the habit she knew well by now, and looked at the table and then at her. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know. I mean specifically this, saying things." He looked up. "I'm better at showing things. I've been trying to show you for months." "I know that too, but I figure you deserve to hear it said plainly." He set the cup down. "I didn't want you here when you came. You know that. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong about 3 days in, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with being that wrong ever since." She waited. "You saved this ranch," he said. "You saved my family. But that's not the thing I'm trying to say. He stopped. He was working at it, the way he worked at difficult physical problems, carefully, without rushing, with respect for how hard the thing was. The thing I'm trying to say is that I look for you. In the morning, before anything else, I hear something in the yard and I think, I wonder if Eleanor's seen this. I figure something out, and the first thing I want to do is tell you. He looked at her steadily. I don't know when that started. I know it doesn't stop. Eleanor looked at him. This man who had opened his door in November with the face of someone who had already done the math and found her wanting. This man who turned coffee cups in his hands when he was thinking, who showed his love to his children through small practical acts rather than speeches, who had stood in a burning yard and trusted her judgment without a moment's hesitation when it mattered. Nobody had ever made her feel before that her presence in a room was something that was looked for. She'd been useful, often. She'd been capable, reliably, but looked for. That was something different. Eleanor Hart, Grant said, will you marry me? He said it as a statement, not a question, which was the most Grant Walker way to propose that she could have imagined, and it was exactly right. Yes, she said, simply, without qualifications or conditions, just yes. He let out a breath. Something in his shoulders changed, a release, physical and visible, the kind that happens when a person has been carrying tension they'd stopped registering as tension. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held it, and they sat that way for a while in the lamplight without needing to say anything else. Outside, the Montana night was dark and enormous and full of stars, and the ranch sat inside it the way it always had. The main barn, the pastures, the fence line in the east where the ground had long since grown back over the holes where the stakes had been. And it was theirs, documented and defended and legally confirmed, as solid and specific as the granite outcropping on the northeast corner that the deed had always named. They told the children in the morning, at breakfast. Clara immediately asked if Eleanor would keep making the biscuits, which Eleanor took as wholehearted approval. Thomas wanted to know if this meant Grant was going to be less pacey in the mornings, which was his word, and which Grant accepted with an expression of resigned parental recognition. Daniel looked at Eleanor across the table for a moment with the complicated look of a 15-year-old who has thought about this more than anyone knew, and then said, good, with the specific weight of someone who means considerably more than one word, but has chosen the right one. She would think about that for a long time afterward. Good. One word, from a boy who'd stood at her door in October with 14 years of grief on his shoulders and asked if things ever got better, and who had gotten, by way of answer, the honest and imperfect and ongoing proof that they could. Sterling Crow's criminal trial was held the following January in Helena. Eleanor and Grant attended both days of the proceedings, leaving the ranch in Daniel's capable management, which had stopped being a remarkable thing to say and had become simply the truth. The courtroom was fuller than Eleanor had expected. Ranchers from across the valley who had lost properties to Crow over 4 years, some of whom hadn't understood until Whitmore's filings exactly what had been done to them, filled the gallery with a quiet, specific anger that wasn't dramatic but was very present. Margaret Doyle was there. Nathan Beckett was there. Abe Fowler was there with his horse and his opinions and his I told you so energy, which he deployed not in a letter to his wife, but simply by being very visibly present in the courtroom. The prosecution's case was built substantially on Eleanor's original documentation. She watched it being used, watched the prosecutor lay out the pattern she'd first identified in February of the previous year, sitting at the kitchen table with a worn ledger and a lamp, and felt something she hadn't quite expected. Not pride, exactly. Pride was too self-satisfied for what it was, more like the particular feeling of having done a thing that needed to be done and seeing it matter. Crow was convicted on 3 counts of fraud, 1 count of conspiracy, and 1 count of arson by proxy. The arson investigation's evidence had been sufficient to link 2 of his men to the feed barn fire, and their testimony, once they understood the extent of what they were facing, had become extremely specific about who had given the orders. The sentence was significant. The judge in Helena was a different judge than Hargrove, but he had apparently read Hargrove's ruling with care and shared her view of what had been done across the valley over 4 years. When it was read out, Eleanor was looking at her hands in her lap, the thin scar across her right palm. She heard Grant beside her exhale again, the same sound he'd made in Helena in August. that specific exhale of something being finally set down. She looked up. Crow was being escorted out of the courtroom. He passed within 10 feet of the gallery, and he looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who has decided that dignity, at this point, is the only thing left worth maintaining. He didn't look at her. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Crow, who had spent years deciding what other people were worth, rarely looked at the people who proved them wrong. It would require updating too many things at once. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the January cold, Margaret Doyle came and stood beside Eleanor. "I have my mending money," Margaret said. "It's not enough to rebuild, but it's something." "The restitution order." "I know, Whitmore explained it." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think I'll see any of it?" Eleanor considered the question honestly, the way she always tried to. "Some of it. The process takes time, and what Crow has is tied up in the investigation. But Whitmore is persistent, and the order is court-issued." She looked at the older woman. "Don't plan around it, but don't stop expecting it either." Margaret nodded. She was looking at the courthouse steps where Crow had come out, already empty now. 8 years, she said. "I built that property in 8 years." "I know. He took it in 18 months. "I know that too." Margaret turned to look at her. "How do you not hate him?" Eleanor thought about that honestly, standing in the cold outside a Helena courthouse. She thought about her father in his yard watching the bankmen take the only thing he'd ever built. She thought about the years between Kansas and Montana. All the houses she'd kept that weren't hers. All the children she'd tended who went on to belong to other people's futures. She thought about a November evening when a man had looked at her like a mistake and she'd gone and lit his stove anyway. "I spent a lot of years being angry at the version of Sterling Crow that took my father's farm," she said finally. "Different name. Same man. I was angry at him for a long time, and it cost me things that were worth more than the anger." She looked at the steps. "I'd rather spend my energy on what I'm building than on what he destroyed. He's in a cell. I have a ranch and a family and a ledger with 41 pages in it that I'm rather proud of." She paused. "The anger doesn't add anything to that." Margaret was quiet. "You make it sound simple," she said. "It isn't," Eleanor said. "I still get angry. I just don't give it the chair at the head of the table." Margaret almost smiled. It didn't quite form, but it was close, and it was real. The restitution process took 14 months. It was slow and complicated and required more of Whitmore's time than any of them had optimistically projected, and it was not complete. Some of what Crow had taken was too thoroughly dispersed to be fully recovered. But it was more than nothing, which is the bar that matters when nothing is what people had resigned themselves to. Margaret Doyle's share was enough to lease a small property on the valley's south road. She sent Eleanor a letter about it. Not a long letter, just a page, in handwriting that was slightly unsteady in the way of someone writing something they'd thought about saying for a long time. She said the property had a kitchen with a south-facing window and she'd planted a kitchen garden already and the soil was decent. She said she thought she might try again with the west pasture in spring if the lease allowed. She said thank you, which she'd apparently been trying to figure out how to say for a year and had finally decided the direct version was the right one. Eleanor read it twice and put it in the back of the ledger. The ledger had accumulated more pages by then. She'd kept up the documentation habit because the habit was useful, not for Crow, who was no longer a relevant variable in their lives, but because good records kept a ranch honest about itself. Where the money went, where the time went, what was working and what was pretending to work and what needed to change. She'd extended it into a full accounting system, which Whitmore had suggested as a professional habit and which Grant had accepted as straightforwardly useful once he saw what it did for the quarterly projections. The ranch, by the second summer, was running better than it had in years, not better than it had ever run. Eleanor was not a person given to superlatives, and the truth was she didn't know what the ranch's best years had been. She'd arrived at its worst ones, but better in a way that was visible in specific, measurable terms. Calves healthy. Feed stores ahead of schedule. The equipment shed had been rebuilt in October, better than the original, with lumber they'd sourced themselves from a mill 2 valleys over that Daniel had negotiated with at 16, with a precision that had made the mill owner visibly reassess the conversation he'd thought he was having. Grant had let Daniel negotiate without intervening, which was one of the better parenting decisions Eleanor had watched him make. Afterward, driving home, Daniel had been quiet for a while and then said, "He was going to give us the worst lumber until I showed him the survey of the load." "I know," Grant said. "You knew before we went in?" "I suspected." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you needed to figure it out, not me." Grant had kept his eyes on the road. "You figured it out." Daniel had been quiet the rest of the drive, processing something. Eleanor had been in the wagon bed with Thomas and Clara, and she'd heard all of it and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Thomas turned 8 in the spring and declared that he wanted to be a veterinarian, inspired by his own memories of Eleanor's treatment of Clara's cough, and his subsequent investigation into what else could be treated with kitchen remedies, and whether there was a profession that systematized this. Eleanor had found him a book on animal medicine at the Helena bookshop on her next trip, and he'd read it 3 times, asking questions about the parts he didn't understand, which she answered when she knew the answer and said plainly when she didn't. "You don't know everything," he observed one afternoon, not as a criticism, just as a data point. "Nobody does," she said. "You know more than most people." "That's not the same as everything." She turned the page she was sewing. "The useful thing isn't knowing everything. The useful thing is knowing what you don't know and being willing to find out." He thought about this. "Is that what you did? With the ledger and crow and all of it?" "Mostly. I knew what I saw and I knew what I didn't know, and I kept finding out until the picture was clear enough to use." Thomas nodded slowly, with the look of a child cataloging a piece of information for future use. "That's a good system," he said. "I think so," she agreed. Clara, at 6, had taken to following Eleanor through the house in the mornings, with the particular devoted purpose of a child who has decided that someone is worth paying attention to and is therefore going to pay very thorough attention. She asked questions at a rate that would have exhausted Eleanor 20 years ago, and that she now found, to her own mild surprise, something close to delightful. Clara wanted to know why bread rose and why the sky was that color in the evening, and what Eleanor had been like when she was small, and whether rabbits knew they were rabbits. "I don't know if they do," Eleanor said, regarding the cloth rabbit that had been Clara's constant companion since before Eleanor arrived, and was now somewhat more worn than it had been. "I think they probably don't," Clara said seriously. "Because if they knew they were rabbits, they'd probably worry about foxes more." "That's a reasonable theory." "You think I'm smart," Clara said. Not asking, stating. "I think you're observant," Eleanor said, "which is better than smart. Smart you're born with. Observant you choose." Clara considered this with enormous seriousness. "I'm going to be both," she decided. "I believe you," Eleanor said, and she did. The evening that Eleanor thought about most afterward, the one that she kept in her memory with the specific care of something she wanted to stay clear, was a September evening in the 2nd year. The work was done, the children fed and settled, the ranch quiet in the way it got in September when the work of summer was behind, and the work of winter hadn't yet fully arrived. She was on the porch. Grant came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the valley in the last light. The pasture's gone gold, the fence line straight and documented and theirs, the mountains in the distance doing what Montana mountains always did in September light, which was look like something a painter had put there specifically to make a point. "Margaret Doyle got her lease," Eleanor said. "I heard. Whitmore wrote." He looked at the valley. "You did that." "We did it. You started it." She let that sit without arguing it, because it was true enough and she was past the age of deflecting true things. She had started it. She'd lit the stove in a cold kitchen in November and made a decision about what she was and wasn't going to walk away from, and everything else had followed from that. Not smoothly. Nothing about any of it had been smooth. And the scar on her right hand was a daily reminder that smooth was not the same as right, but forward. Always forward. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "Margaret isn't the only one starting over. There are families in this valley that lost years to crow and got some resources back, but not the knowledge. The accounting, the documentation, the patterns that tell you when something's wrong before it's gone too far." She looked at the valley. "Someone should be teaching it." Grant looked at her. "You want to run a school." "Not a school." She thought about how to say it accurately. "More like making myself available to families who need someone to look at their books and tell them honestly what they're seeing, Not for money necessarily, for the kind of thing that gets repaid in other ways. She paused. I know what I'm good at. I spent 43 years being good at it in other people's houses. It seems like I could be good at it for other people's benefit, rather than just keeping their accounts from falling apart quietly. Grant was quiet for a moment. You've already started, haven't you? He said. I've had a few conversations. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his version of deep affection, which looked to anyone who didn't know him like mild interest, but which she had learned to read in the slight shift of his jaw and the way his eyes held hers a beat longer than necessary. Of course you have, he said. She looked back at the valley. It was fully evening now, the last of the light gone from the peaks, the land going blue and gray in the way it did in this hour. She thought about the woman she'd been in the Billings boarding house, reading an advertisement about a cattle ranch in Montana that wanted a capable woman of good character. She thought about the belt around the suitcase and the folded paper in her pocket and the stagecoach that smelled of tobacco and the girl with the hat box and the red-rimmed eyes going west to marry a stranger. She thought about all the things she hadn't known she was heading toward. The advertisement had not promised love. It had not promised family or belonging or the particular feeling of lying awake in a house at night and knowing every sound it makes and calling that feeling home. It had promised room, board, and a fair arrangement. By the terms of the original offer, it had delivered. Everything else had been built from scratch, the way everything worth having is built, imperfectly, with wrong turns and insufficient materials and moments of genuine doubt, by people who were too tired and too stubborn to stop. She'd spent her whole life being useful. It turned out that being useful, if you did it honestly and for long enough in the right place, eventually became something more than useful. It became indispensable. It became woven into things. It became part of the architecture of a life, and then of more than one life, and then of something that didn't fully belong to any one person anymore, but to all of them together. The woman nobody wanted had become the person nobody could imagine the place without. She hadn't planned that. She'd just stayed. There's something worth saying about that. About the decision to stay when leaving is available, and the ground is uncertain, and the welcome is thin. Most people understand that love requires vulnerability, that growth requires discomfort, that the worthwhile things take time. But the specific version of it that Eleanor had lived, the choice to commit fully to something before you knew if it would commit back, to make yourself useful before anyone had asked, to look clearly at a difficult situation and decide that your presence mattered before anyone had confirmed that it did, that version gets talked about less. It requires believing, in the absence of evidence, that your effort is worth making, that you are worth the space you take up in a difficult moment, that capable and good character are enough if you keep showing up. Eleanor had believed that, not easily and not all the time, but enough. Grant sat down in the other porch chair, and the September dark came up around the ranch. And somewhere inside the house, Clara was singing one of her wordless, purposeless, entirely personal songs, and the sound came through the wall like something warm. Come inside when you're ready, Grant said. In a minute, she said. She stayed on the porch a little longer, looking at the valley, her valley now, their valley, the valley with the fixed fence lines and the documented boundaries and the families starting over in it. The valley that Sterling Crow had thought he was going to own entirely and didn't. She thought about her father's yard, the bankmen, the 12-year-old girl who had watched and understood and couldn't do anything. She had done something. It had taken 31 years and a worn suitcase and a belt holding it shut, but she had done something. That was enough, more than enough. She got up and went inside where the lamp was burning and the stove was warm and her family was waiting, and she closed the door on the September night behind her.